Hello, Sleepy Whisper listeners. Before we begin, I invite you to set your volume just right, soft, gentle, not too loud, not too quiet. Now close your eyes, lie back, and allow yourself to be still. Together, we will drift slowly into rest. Tonight, we begin this first story in our Boring History for Sleep series. A tale told not to excite, but to calm, to let your mind wander and your body sink deeper into comfort. This episode is called The Last Day of a Forgotten Calendar. If you enjoy this journey, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. That way, you will always have a gentle story waiting for you each night. Now, let us begin. In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not of battles or kings, but of the small details that once guided everyday life and then slowly drifted into obscurity. One such story is about a calendar, not the one we know today with January, February, and the neat sequence of months, but an older system that once marked the passage of days for a people who no longer exist as they once did. To imagine their world, picture a village where the sky was watched more carefully than the market stalls, where the stars above were as familiar as the tools in a farmer's hand, and where time itself felt less like numbers on a page and more like a rhythm carried by the seasons. This forgotten calendar, whose final day was once marked with solemn ceremony, belonged to a culture that measured existence differently. For them, time was not a line stretching endlessly forward, but a circle, turning again and again. They believed that to complete the circle was to give thanks for what had passed, and to prepare, quietly, for what would return. Archaeologists tell us fragments of these systems survive on stone carvings, on worn tablets, and in inscriptions etched so faintly they nearly disappear under the weight of centuries. When we look at them now, our minds might struggle to see more than symbols, but to those who first carved them, every mark carried meaning. A single line could mark a planting season, a festival, or the beginning of rains that were desperately awaited. Imagine then the final day of their year. It was not a loud day, not filled with fireworks or parades. It was instead a day of pause. A day where villagers would gather by torchlight, listening to elders recite stories of seasons past, reminding the young that the cycles of life were steady and reliable, even when individual lives felt fragile. The fire would flicker, the wind would move softly over fields left bare after harvest, and the people would feel, in a way, both the weight of endings and the comfort of beginnings. Some ancient writings suggest that food offerings were left at the edge of their fields, not to gods in the way we often imagine, but to the earth itself, to thank it for yielding what it could. On that last evening of the calendar, silence was considered a virtue. Families would sit together, saying little, only watching the flames of the fire or the steady movement of stars. The stillness, they believed, allowed the world to breathe before the new cycle began. It is a strange thought for us now, who often mark endings with noise, parties, and the rush of celebration. For them, stillness was not emptiness but fullness. As if by being quiet, they gave space for time itself to turn over and start again. The forgotten calendar has no place in our daily lives today. Our modern systems, refined by astronomers and adjusted by emperors and popes, replace these older rhythms with something more precise and universal. Yet the memory of that old cycle lingers in traces, in a ruined stone, in a fragment of inscription, in the way agricultural communities still, without always realizing it, follow the rise and fall of seasons more than the numbers printed on a wall calendar. To think of the last day of such a calendar is to think of a people leaning gently into the passage of time, not with resistance, not with hurry, but with a slow acceptance. Their year closed like a book read once more, knowing the story would be told again when the circle returned. And though centuries have passed, and though we will never stand in their fields or hear the voices of their elders, the image of that quiet night lingers, the final fires dimming, the stars unchanging, and the people waiting silently for the circle of time to begin again. In this way, the forgotten calendar teaches us something subtle. It reminds us that time does not always need to be chased. It can be observed, respected, and trusted. The last day was never a farewell, only a pause, like the moment of silence between one breath and the next. Tonight, as you listen, you may feel the same rhythm, the same calm. The old year rests, the new one approaches, and all is quiet. When we think about calendars today, we imagine neat pages with boxes to fill, numbers aligned in predictable order, and perhaps small notes scribbled to remind us of appointments or birthdays. But for the people who once followed the forgotten calendar, time was measured differently, not by written schedules, but by observation and memory. The first day of the year might not have been written down, but it was felt, marked by the changing position of the sun or the lengthening of shadows in the fields. To them, the last day of the year was simply the turning point, a natural pause that closed one cycle and opened another. Historical traces suggest that these calendars were less about counting days and more about harmonizing with what they saw in nature. The arrival of birds, the swelling of rivers, the growth of crops, all of these were as significant as numbers could ever be. If the rains came late, the calendar shifted. If the harvest was plentiful, celebrations stretched longer. It was a living system, one that breathed alongside the people who depended on it. Archaeologists often debate whether the forgotten calendar was lunar, solar, or a mixture of both. Some fragments of inscriptions hint at cycles of the moon, with its waxing and waning carefully observed. Other fragments show alignment with solstices and equinoxes, when the sun marked the longest or shortest days. Perhaps it was both, for ancient cultures were rarely rigid. They took what they needed from the sky, blending systems to guide their lives in ways that felt reliable enough. The last day of the calendar, however, was always significant. In some records, faint though they are, this day is described as one of cleansing. Fires were lit not only for warmth, but for renewal. Ashes from the fires were scattered on the soil, as if to remind the earth that it too must rest before giving again. People washed their faces in river water, believing that with the old year gone, any misfortune could be carried downstream. The stillness of the evening was not merely habit, it was ritual. Families gathered in the dim light, their faces quiet, their hands folded in their laps. Children were taught not to ask too many questions on that night, for the elders said silence honored the turning of the year. To us it may seem unusual, but to them the quiet was sacred. It gave weight to the moment, allowing everyone to feel that they stood at the edge of one cycle and the beginning of another. Over time, as empires rose and fell, such calendars began to fade. Conquerors brought their own ways of measuring time, and gradually the older systems slipped into memory. Some were absorbed, reshaped to fit new rules, while others disappeared entirely, their meanings left behind in fragments too faint to fully recover. Yet the thought of that final day lingers. Imagine an entire village sitting in the fading glow of firelight. No urgency, no rush, only a collective awareness that the year was ending and another would arrive. The fields lay bare after harvest, the tools were put away, the animals were settled, and the people themselves rested. Their sense of time was never about chasing deadlines or anticipating alarms. It was about breathing in rhythm with the world around them. The forgotten calendar in its final day captures that essence. It was less a day on a chart and more a shared experience, a pause that allowed both Earth and people to reset together. For modern minds accustomed to noise, speed, and constant distraction, this practice might feel alien. But in its simplicity, it carries a lesson. To pause is not to lose time. To pause is to give it meaning. The people of that forgotten age understood this deeply, and so they closed their year with silence, with gratitude, and with quiet anticipation. As centuries passed, their system was abandoned, their days were replaced, and their cycles forgotten by most. But in the fragments left behind, in the faint marks on stone or clay, we can still sense the echo of that rhythm. And when we think of their last day, we can almost feel the warmth of the fire, hear the hush of voices, and see the stars unchanged above them. It was, in every sense, not the end, but a beginning concealed in silence. When we study the fragments of these ancient timekeeping systems, we find that what they left behind was never just about dates. A calendar was not only a way of marking when to plant or when to harvest, but also a reflection of how a society understood the world itself. The forgotten calendar we speak of may not have survived in complete form, but the remnants show that its people saw themselves as part of a cycle, larger than their own lives. Each month, or what we might call a cycle, corresponded to natural signs. One might begin with the first rains, another with the ripening of certain fruits, another with the migration of birds across the skies. These markers were not arbitrary, for to them nature was the truest clock, a steady reminder of what came before and what would come after. The last day of their year carried a symbolic weight greater than any festival or celebration. It was the day they acknowledged that everything they had done, the planting, the tending of crops, the gathering, the storing, was complete for that cycle. Nothing more could be added to the year. It was full, it was finished, and now it was time to let it pass. Some anthropologists suggest that on this day, people would sweep their homes carefully, pushing out the ashes from their hearths, setting aside worn tools, and placing fresh water in clay jars. These gestures may appear simple, but they spoke of renewal. The hearth was cleared so new fires could burn. The tools were set aside to rest as the people rested, and the fresh water was a symbol of life carried into the next year. There is something deeply calming in imagining this slow ritual. No one hurried, no one feared missing out. They trusted that the circle of time would carry them forward, just as it always had. The forgotten calendar also hints at communal gatherings on this final day. Evidence suggests that people would meet in open areas, near fields or rivers, forming quiet circles while elders recited stories. These stories did not change much from year to year, but that was their purpose. They repeated them so that children would remember, and so that adults would be reminded. It was not a search for novelty, but for continuity. The elders would speak of how time was like the seasons, patient and endless, and that every end was also a beginning. In that calm retelling, the people found reassurance. The night would then fall, and as torches dimmed, the stars would seem brighter. The villagers would tilt their heads upward, noting the constellations in their positions. They knew the stars would return in the same places in the future, just as they always had. It was this familiarity, this constancy, that gave them peace. To look at the sky was to look at a clock that never failed. It told them that though their lives were short, the rhythm of the world endured. The rhythm, by the time the last day faded, they would feel ready for the cycle to begin again. Today, we often measure value by speed, by productivity, by how much can be achieved in the shortest time. To the people of the forgotten calendar, value was found in rhythm, in harmony, in giving each part of the year its place and respecting the transition from one to the next. Their forgotten day was not a holiday in the way we understand it. It was a moment of stillness deliberately created, so that the community could pause together before moving forward. As we picture them in our minds, gathered in the soft glow of firelight, we can almost feel the texture of their time. It was slower, steadier, and quieter than ours, yet not less meaningful. In fact, it may have been richer in meaning, for it was lived in awareness of the natural world. The forgotten calendar, though it has crumbled into fragments, whispers to us even now. It tells us that there was once a way of marking time, not with urgency, but with patience, not with noise, but with silence. The last day, as they saw it, was not the closing of a door, but the opening of another, and the silence that accompanied it was not emptiness, but readiness. To listen to this memory is to step, for a moment, into their world, a world where the rhythm of the earth was enough, and where every ending carried within it the quiet promise of return. The traces we hold of this forgotten calendar may seem small, scratched markings on stone, faded carvings on temple walls, or fragments of clay tablets that have weathered centuries. But from these fragments, historians and archaeologists can reconstruct a sense of how time once flowed for these people. Unlike the precise calculations of modern astronomy, their system was closer to poetry. A crescent moon rising above the horizon signaled more than just a date. It was the beginning of a period of work or rest. A cluster of stars visible just before dawn meant it was time to prepare the soil or mend tools. The turning of the year was not separate from daily life. It was woven into it. On the last day of the year, this sense of woven time reached its peak. Imagine a settlement at dusk. Small houses of mud or stone arranged in a circle, smoke rising gently from cooking fires. The air is cool, the fields around them bare, harvested weeks before, and the people gather together knowing that the cycle is about to turn. There is no rush to the gathering. People arrive slowly, families drifting toward the central space, carrying baskets of grain or small offerings of fruit. Elders sit near the fire, their faces lined with years, their voices steady as they prepare to speak. Children cluster near their parents, restless but hushed by gentle reminders that this is a night of stillness. As the sun disappears, the the firelight grows more prominent. Flames crackle, sparks rise, and shadows dance along the walls of the houses. The people fall into silence. It is not the heavy silence of fear, but the soft quiet of respect. In that quiet, the elders begin to recite. Their words are not stories of heroes or battles, but of the cycle itself. They remind the people that the rains will come again, that the soil will bear crops once more, that the river will rise and fall as it always has. They remind them that although each individual life may be short and fragile, the rhythm of the world is steady and endless. These words are not new, but they are needed, repeated every year to anchor the community in trust and patience. Scholars believe that some offerings were placed directly into the earth that evening. Small handfuls of grain might be scattered near the fields, not wasted but given as thanks. Some pieces of pottery found near ancient sites suggest that bowls of water or wine were poured gently onto the soil, the liquid soaking into the ground as a gesture of gratitude. To modern minds, such actions may appear symbolic, but to them they were real exchanges with the world that sustained them. The earth had given, and now it was to be given back, if only in small measure. The night would pass slowly. Families would remain together by the fires, speaking little, only watching the flames diminish. From time to time, someone might look up at the sky, tracing constellations that had guided generations before them. They knew that when those stars shifted slightly, when they appeared in different places at dawn or dusk, the cycle was turning. This knowledge was not written in books, but carried in memory, passed from parent to child. To mark the last day of their calendar was to practice patience, to acknowledge that time itself required no grand gestures, only awareness. In the modern world, where seconds are measured by precise clocks and events are planned down to the minute, this older rhythm may feel distant. Yet there is something calming in remembering that once time was kept by firelight, starlight, and the quiet turning of seasons. The forgotten calendar was less about control and more about acceptance. Its last day was not about forcing a new beginning, but about allowing the old year to fade naturally, like the embers of a fire settling into ash. And in that fading, the people found peace. When dawn arrived after the last day, it did not come with shouts or noise. It came with the same soft light as any other day, the same calls of birds in the fields, the same sound of water moving in the river. Yet to them it was new. It was the first breath of the cycle renewed. The fields would wait to be planted, the tools would wait to be used, and the people would carry on, reassured by the circle that had once more completed itself. For us, centuries later, what remains is the idea that such a quiet, forgotten practice once guided entire communities. The last day of their calendar, though hidden from our modern world, remains a reminder that time is not only a line to be measured, but a rhythm to be felt. And in that rhythm, even in silence, there is meaning. The more we look into the forgotten calendar, the more we realize that it was never just a system of counting days, but rather a framework that connected people to their surroundings and to one another. The calendar was a mirror of the environment, a guide that taught them when to sow seeds, when to let the land rest, when to prepare for lean times, and when to celebrate abundance. The last day of the year, as reconstructed from fragments and traditions, was not meant to be an isolated point, but a culmination, a closing gesture that held together the entire rhythm of the past cycle. It was a moment that tied their daily labors to their beliefs and their lives to the larger turning of nature. Imagine the slow approach of this final day. In the weeks leading up to it, the harvest had already been completed, and food supplies stored carefully in clay jars or woven baskets. Tools were cleaned and set aside. Paths through the fields were walked one last time, not for work, but as a way of seeing what the year had given. People may have gathered in smaller groups, speaking in low voices about what the year had brought, whether the rains had been generous, whether illnesses had passed lightly or heavily through the village, whether the animals had thrived. As the last day drew near, a sense of pause would have spread, not unlike the way we today feel the slowing of the years as winter deepens. But their pause was not filled with shopping or noise. It was filled with waiting, a waiting that was peaceful and deliberate. On the actual last day, ceremonies were small but deeply symbolic. Fires were stoked carefully, and ashes from old flames were gathered. Some communities may have sprinkled these ashes at the edges of their fields, letting them drift into the soil as both memory and blessing. Others may have taken small amounts of food and set them aside, not for people, but for the unseen forces of earth and sky that had allowed life to continue. Such gestures remind us that in their world, time was never separate from survival, and survival was never separate from gratitude. The night was the most important part. Families would sit together in a quiet circle, their faces lit only by firelight and the stars above. Elders would repeat words that had been spoken countless times before, steadying the younger generations with lessons that were not meant to surprise, but to reassure. These words told them that endings were not losses, but transitions, that silence was not emptiness, but fullness, and that the rhythm of the world could be trusted more than the uncertain turns of fortune. While the specific phrases have been lost, the pattern remains. Words spoken slowly, carrying weight through repetition, sinking into the memory of listeners who would one day repeat them in their turn. Scholars who have studied these practices note that even though the calendar itself disappeared, echoes of it may survive in later traditions. The idea of sweeping out homes before the start of a new year, the idea of resting fields, the idea of offering small gifts to nature, these can be seen across cultures, perhaps faint reflections of much older cycles. Though each community changed with time, the underlying belief remained that the end of a year was best honored with quiet gratitude and gentle transition. By midnight, or what passed for midnight in their reckoning of time, there would have been no countdown, no sudden eruption of sound. Instead, there was the gradual dimming of flames, the crackle of wood settling, the gentle hush that fell as families grew tired. The last voices would fade into silence, and only the stars, cold and steady, would remain. In that stillness, the people felt themselves part of something larger than their own lives. They were not racing ahead into the future, but resting within the eternal circle. When dawn broke, the first light falling on the fields would have marked the beginning of the new cycle. People would wake slowly, refreshed not by noise, but by quiet. They would rise to tend to animals, to prepare food, to carry on as always, but with the unspoken knowledge that a new round had begun. To us, accustomed to calendars that stretch endlessly forward, the idea of time as a circle may feel unusual. Yet in many ways, it offered a comfort that linear time cannot. For if time is a line, it may run out. But if time is a circle, it always returns, always repeats, always offers renewal. The last day of their calendar carried this truth, and though the calendar itself has been forgotten, the lesson endures. It is a reminder that we too might find peace in pause, that we might listen to the rhythm of seasons and stars instead of only to the ticking of clocks. In doing so, perhaps we would discover what they once knew, that endings are never absolute, and that every last day carries within it the quiet promise of a first day yet to come. To imagine the forgotten calendar more fully, one must place oneself in the rhythm of a world that moved more slowly than ours, where each day unfolded not against the ticking of clocks, but against the steady arc of the sun. The people who lived by the cycle did not think of time as numbers, but as sensations, as the feel of air cooling in autumn, as the sound of rivers swelling in spring, as the sight of stars shifting slightly in the sky with each passing week. Their calendar was not an abstract creation, but an intimate companion, a silent guide that wove itself into the fabric of their existence. And so, when the last day of that calendar arrived, it was approached with a kind of reverence that we can only begin to reconstruct through scattered evidence and the imagination that fills the gaps. Archaeologists examining sites linked to these people have uncovered fire pits carefully layered with ash from multiple years, suggesting that the final night of the calendar was marked by ritual fires rekindled again and again at the same spot. Ashes were not discarded casually but preserved, pressed into soil, scattered at the edges of villages, or even stored in small containers as tokens of continuity. To them, ash was not waste but memory, evidence of flames that had warmed and guided them through cycles past. The gathering on that night was communal but subdued. Families carried baskets of grain or fruit, placing small portions aside before eating. It was not a feast of excess, but a quiet sharing of what had been preserved after harvest. Children were given only simple food, plain bread or roasted seeds, to remind them that the night was about reflection, not indulgence. At the center of the village, Elders spoke in voices steady and deliberate, repeating verses that may have been memorized across generations. These verses are lost to us, but by analogy with other ancient traditions, they likely describe the turning of the world, the dependence of people on land and sky, and the reassurance that what ended would surely begin again. The night, therefore, was not empty. It was filled with gestures, with pauses, with moments of silence that carried more weight than words. As the firelight flickered, faces glowed softly, eyes lowered, breaths slowed. It was a collective stillness, one that bound the community together, not through noise, but through quiet presence. Modern scholars sometimes describe such ceremonies as liminal, moments in between, where one cycle ends but another has not yet begun. In such spaces, people feel suspended, not fully belonging to the past or the future, but resting in the fragile present. This was what the last day represented for them, a deliberate suspension of ordinary life, a pause to acknowledge that time itself was about to shift. The stars above played their role in the ritual as well. For those who lived by the forgotten calendar, the heavens were the truest clock. And so the last night was also a night of watching. Families tilted their heads skyward, tracing constellations, observing the position of the moon, noting subtle changes that marked the season's turn. Some inscriptions suggest that the rising of certain stars near dawn signaled the true beginning of the new cycle. If clouds covered the sky, people would wait patiently, trusting that the stars were there, even if unseen. This trust was essential, for in their world, faith in the rhythm of nature was what allowed them to endure the hardships of famine, illness, or storm. When the fires burned low and the voices of the elders fell silent, the night was left to stillness. People would drift into sleep slowly, sometimes right there near the fire, wrapped in cloaks, listening to the crackle of embers and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. It was not a celebration of noise, but a surrender to quiet. And in that quiet, they felt the year pass. The dawn that followed was gentle, not marked by drums or bells, but by the ordinary sounds of morning: roosters crowing, water being drawn, children stirring awake. Yet it was understood by all that this dawn was different. It was the dawn of renewal, the first light of a cycle reborn. And so the people rose with calm assurance, ready to begin again. For us today, the story of this forgotten calendar offers a different kind of lesson. It shows us that the passage of time does not always require noise, spectacle, or urgency. Sometimes it requires silence, patience, and trust. The last day of their year embodied this truth. It was a space carved out of the ordinary flow of life, a moment when people stepped back, allowed the world to breathe, and then stepped forward again when the time was right. Though centuries have passed and though the details of their system have been lost, the essence remains. Time, they remind us, is not only measured by clocks and pages, but by the rhythm of the earth and sky. And in that rhythm, endings and beginnings are never far apart. When we speak of the forgotten calendar, we must remember that it was not only a tool for measuring time, but also a way of shaping the rhythm of life itself. Every community that relied upon it was bound together by the understanding that they were part of something larger than their own individual lives, something steady and cyclical, something that could be trusted even when everything else seemed uncertain. The last day of the year in this ancient reckoning carried with it a quiet significance, not because it brought loud festivities or striking displays, but because it reminded everyone that life was bound by patterns, and those patterns always returned. Imagine the slow unfolding of this day. From the moment dawn rose, people treated the hours differently. Work was not pursued in the same hurried way as before. Fields were left untouched, tools were set aside, and animals were tended only with what was necessary. It was a day when the pace of life deliberately slowed. Families spent the daylight hours together, often sitting in shaded places or near riverbanks, speaking less than usual. It was believed that conserving words was part of honoring the turn of the year, for too much speech might disturb the transition. Children, usually free to play noisily, were reminded to remain calm, to watch the movements of the elders, and to learn the lessons of silence. By afternoon, preparations for the night began. Fires were readied with wood carefully chosen and dried, for the flame was considered more than warmth. It was continuity, carrying the memory of the old year into the new. Small tokens might be prepared, not grand offerings, but humble things that carried meaning: a piece of bread, a handful of grain, a clay lamp filled with oil. Each of these items had its place in the rituals that followed, gestures of gratitude for what had been received and hope for what was still to come. As evening approached, the people gathered in central places, often circular spaces marked by stones or earth, where generations had gathered before them. The circle itself mattered, for it mirrored the shape of time as they understood it, without beginning or end, only constant turning. When the fire was lit, its smoke curled upward into the darkening sky, carrying with it the memory of all that had passed. Families sat in rings around the flame, watching as sparks rose into the night. Elders began to speak, their words familiar, repeated from year to year, but no less meaningful for their repetition. They spoke of cycles of planting and harvest, of rains and droughts, of health and sickness, of loss and renewal. They reminded the people that just as the stars returned each year, so too did fortune, even if it seemed delayed. The children listened, their eyes wide in the glow of the firelight, absorbing words that they would one day repeat. Archaeologists believe that on this night, people sometimes trace small patterns in the dirt, simple circles or lines meant to represent the passage of the year. Some of these markings have been found near ancient settlements, faint impressions preserved by accident. They are not elaborate, but they carry the essence of a people who saw time as something they could mark with their hands, even if only briefly. When night deepened, silence grew. The elders would fall quiet, the younger adults would settle, and the fire would be allowed to burn lower. Only the sounds of the natural world remained, the soft wind moving through empty fields, the distant call of animals, the occasional crackle of wood. In that silence, the people felt the transition. They believed that by remaining still, they honored the moment when the old year ended and the new one began. It was not something to be shouted into existence, but something to be welcomed gently. The dawn that followed was treated with equal care. When the first light touched the horizon, people stirred slowly, carrying with them the knowledge that a new cycle had begun. They might pour fresh water into bowls, light small fires in their hearths, and share simple meals to mark the renewal. Nothing dramatic was needed. The year had turned, as it always would, and their place within it was secure. For us, the memory of this forgotten calendar offers a lesson that remains relevant even across centuries. It shows us that time can be honored without noise, that endings can be observed with stillness, and that beginnings do not need spectacle to carry meaning. The last day, in its quietness, was a day of peace, a day of trust in the eternal rhythm of the world. Though their calendar has faded from history, the image of that night endures. People gathered in silence, firelight flickering on their faces, stars steady above, waiting together for the circle to turn once more. To continue the story of this forgotten calendar, we must linger on how deeply the people who used it tied their lives to cycles beyond themselves. Their entire existence was organized not around hours and minutes, which did not matter in their world, but around the larger patterns of nature. The turning of the moon, the rising and setting of constellations, the swelling of rivers, and the growth of crops. All of these were the framework of time. And within this framework, the last day of the calendar carried a significance far beyond what we might expect. It was not a number written on parchment, but a living threshold, a moment where one world ended and another began. On that day, work slowed almost to nothing. Even the most diligent farmers and herders treated the hours with care, tending only to necessities, conserving energy, and preparing their minds for the coming night. The very atmosphere of the village shifted. Conversations grew softer, children were guided to stillness, and even animals seemed part of the waiting. By late afternoon, as shadows lengthened and air cooled, preparations for the closing of the year began. Firewood was stacked with care, water was drawn from wells or rivers, and families gathered the small offerings they would bring: grain, fruit, oil, or cloth. These were not lavish gifts but simple acknowledgments, chosen with humility. When the sun dipped below the horizon, people came together in communal spaces, usually circles marked by stone or earth, places where generations had gathered before. The fire was lit, its flames reaching upward into the night, and as the crackle of wood filled the air, the people sat quietly, gazing into the light. Around them, the vast sky stretched unbroken, the stars already visible and bright. For these people, the stars were more than decoration. They were reminders of continuity, the eternal pattern that governed not just seasons, but life itself. Some constellations marked times of planting, others of harvest, and still others signaled storms or changes in weather. On this night, the stars served another purpose. They bore witness to the passing of one cycle and the beginning of another. Elders spoke in low, measured tones, their words familiar and repeated, not to entertain, but to steady the minds of those who listened. They spoke of rivers that had overflowed and then receded, of crops that had withered and then thrived, of sickness that had passed through the people and left them to heal. Their words were reminders that no hardship lasted forever, that time itself carried balance, that whatever had been lost in one season would, in some form, return in another. The fire burned slowly, and the people drew warmth from it not only for their bodies, but for their spirits. Some placed small tokens into the flames, dried herbs, bits of grain, or pieces of wood, gestures meant to honor what had been and to prepare for what would come. The air filled with the smell of smoke and earth, and the sound of night creatures echoed faintly around the settlement. As the hours deepened, silence became the true ritual. One by one, words faded, conversations dwindled, and only the soft crackle of the fire remained. Families sat together in stillness, breathing in rhythm with one another, aware that they were sharing the exact moment when the old year slipped away. For them, silence was not emptiness, but fullness, a space where the weight of the past could be released and the hope of the future allowed in. Some scholars suggest that people closed their eyes deliberately at midnight, not to sleep, but to enter the new cycle inwardly, with reflection. Whether or not this detail is true, it captures the spirit of their practice. Endings were not meant to be noisy but meditative. Beginnings not forced but welcomed. The dawn that followed was quiet but radiant. Light touched the fields first, then the rooftops, then the people themselves as they stirred from rest. They greeted the new cycle not with fanfare, but with calm. Fresh water was poured into jars, fires were rekindled in hearths, and simple food was shared among families. It was enough. The year had turned, and life could continue. What we see in this forgotten calendar, then, is not merely an ancient system lost to time, but a philosophy of how to live with time itself. The last day was never about fear of endings, but about trust in beginnings. It was about letting go with peace, about embracing silence as a teacher, about stepping into the unknown with steady hearts. Though centuries have hidden the details, though the calendar itself lies in fragments, the essence remains. Time is not only a measure to be tracked, but a rhythm to be felt. And within that rhythm, every last day is also the quiet birth of another. The forgotten calendar lingers in memory, not through complete records, but through fragments, patterns, and the quiet persistence of traditions that echo it even now. To understand its last day more deeply, one must imagine how its people saw themselves within a vast and recurring pattern. They believed that time was not theirs to command, but theirs to honor. Each day was borrowed, each season a gift, each year a circle turning once more. And so, when the last day arrived, they did not treat it as something to escape or something to fear. They treated it as a threshold, a doorway between what had been and what would come again. From morning to dusk, the day unfolded with restraint. People walked more slowly, spoke more gently, and even their tasks carried a ritual quality. Water was poured carefully, bread was baked deliberately, tools were put away with quiet hands. These gestures were not accidents, but conscious acts of closure, as if by slowing themselves they could align with the slow turning of the cycle itself. Children watched and imitated, their games subdued, their laughter softened, for they were taught that the day was sacred. As evening approached, anticipation grew, but not in the way we know it today. There were no loud celebrations, no sense of rushing toward midnight. Instead, there was a steady gathering of families and neighbors, moving together into the heart of the settlement, circling around fires that had been prepared with care. The fire was the centerpiece of the night, its flames symbolizing continuity, its ashes destined to be scattered or stored as tokens of memory. Around the fire, people arranged themselves in rings, the shape mirroring the eternal circle of time they believed in. The elders began to speak, their words slow, their tone deliberate, as though the rhythm of their speech was itself part of the ritual. They did not tell new stories, but repeated the same lessons year after year, reminding their listeners of the constancy of nature and the dependability of the cycle. They spoke of rivers that swelled and then shrank, of fields that emptied and then flourished, of sickness that came and then receded. of storms that broke and then passed. The message was always the same. Nothing endured forever, but nothing was lost forever either. In repetition, there was comfort, and in comfort, there was trust. Some families brought offerings, small baskets of grain, fruit, or oil, and placed them near the fire. The gesture was simple but powerful, acknowledging that the abundance of the past cycle was not to be taken for granted. These offerings were not sacrifices in the sense of dramatic rituals, but acts of gratitude, a way of saying thank you to the land and sky that had sustained them. As the night deepened, silence spread across the gathering. The fire still burned, the stars still glittered, but voices fell away until only the crackle of wood and the distant sounds of the natural world remained. This silence was the true heart of the ritual. In stillness, people felt themselves at the edge of time, balanced between what had been and what was yet to come. They believed that by keeping quiet, they created space for the year to pass peacefully and for the new cycle to enter gently. Midnight came not with noise, but with calm. Some closed their eyes, others simply sat and breathed, but all shared in the awareness that the moment of transition had arrived. To them, it was not the end of something, but the renewal of everything. When dawn finally broke, it was welcomed with equal calm. People rose slowly, rekindled small fires in their homes, and poured fresh water into jars. Children were given bread from the new day's baking, a symbol that the cycle had begun again. There was no sense of rushing into the future, only a quiet assurance that time had turned and life could continue. For us, the forgotten calendar remains more than an artifact of history. It is a reminder of another way of being with time, one that does not measure worth by speed or urgency, but by harmony and patience. Its last day teaches us that closure can be quiet, that renewal can be gentle, and that the rhythm of the world is more reliable than any plan we can make. Though the calendar itself is lost, its wisdom remains. It whispers to us that every ending is also a beginning, that silence is not emptiness but presence, and that the circle of time, whether we mark it or not, always turns again. As we bring our story of the forgotten calendar to its close, it is worth reflecting on what it truly meant for the people who once lived by its rhythm. To them, the last day of the year was never about endings in the way we often think of them now. It was not about marking what had been lost, nor about regretting what had not been done. Instead, it was a day of trust, of quiet gratitude, of allowing time itself to pass without resistance. The calendar was a circle, and circles, by their nature, never stop. Each ending was already the seed of a beginning. On that final day, the entire community seemed to breathe more slowly. The air itself carried a weight of stillness, as if nature too was pausing. Fires burned steadily, not rushed, not blazing, but calm and enduring. People sat together, not speaking much, yet united by the shared understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves. Children looked at the stars, wondering if they would always return in the same patterns. And the elders reminded them that indeed, they always had and always would. This faith in the cycle was what gave them strength, what allowed them to endure lean years and to celebrate abundant ones, knowing both were only phases in the eternal turning of time. Archaeological evidence suggests that the last day may have included simple acts of renewal. Some families likely swept out their homes, removing the dust of the old year to make space for the new. Others sprinkled water at their doorways, a gesture of cleansing. The ashes of fires were scattered on the soil, ensuring that the memory of warmth and light would remain even after the flames had faded. These small rituals, though humble, carried profound meaning. They were acknowledgments that life depended on balance, on giving and receiving, on remembering and letting go. As night deepened, the silence of the community grew heavier, yet it was not oppressive. It was soothing, like the quiet hum of the earth itself. The people believed that by keeping still, they allowed the passage of time to unfold smoothly, without disruption. The stars above did not hurry, neither did they. And in that patience, they found peace. When the final hours of the old cycle slipped away, it was not with noise or spectacle, but with calm awareness. Midnight arrived as softly as any other moment, yet it carried with it the weight of transition. Some closed their eyes deliberately, as if to greet the new cycle from within. Others simply sat, breathing slowly, their faces lit by the last glow of embers. In their stillness, they trusted that the world would turn again, just as it always had. and when dawn finally broke, it was welcomed not as a surprise, but as a continuation. Light touched the earth, the river, the rooftops, and the people themselves. Fires were relit, water was refreshed, and simple meals were shared. Children were given bread, parents tended animals, elders offered words of quiet blessing. Life resumed as though nothing had changed, and yet everything had, for the cycle had begun anew. To us, separated by centuries, and by the strict ticking of modern clocks, such a practice may seem distant, but its wisdom is not lost. The forgotten calendar reminds us that time does not always need to be conquered or controlled. It can be observed, honored, and trusted. The last day of the year, in its silence, was a reminder that rest is as important as action, that stillness is as meaningful as movement. And though we no longer gather around fires to watch the stars, in quite the same way, we can still carry that lesson. In our own lives, we can pause, we can breathe, we can trust that endings are not final, but part of a greater rhythm. The forgotten calendar has long since disappeared from use, its fragments lying silent in museums or buried beneath earth and stone. But its spirit endures in the quiet rituals we still keep, in the ways we mark new beginnings with small acts of renewal, in the sense that time is more than numbers. It is a rhythm we all share. And so, as we close the story, imagine once more that ancient village, sitting in silence on the final night of the year. The fire flickers, the stars shine above, the people breathe together, waiting calmly for the circle to turn. In that image lies the essence of their wisdom, that every last day is also the first day, and that in silence, we too can find peace. And so our old story comes to an end. Before we move on, if you enjoyed this quiet journey, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps keep these calm stories alive. Now, let us drift gently into the next tale in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we arrive at the abandoned temple no one worships in. There are places scattered across the earth that once held deep meaning, where voices rose in prayer, where footsteps echoed against stone, where the presence of people gave life to walls and columns. Yet time, which changes everything, eventually leaves some of these places behind. The temple we speak of tonight is one such place, a building raised long ago with care and devotion, but now standing in silence, its halls empty, its altars unused, its doorways open only to wind and shadow. To understand the story of this abandoned temple, one must first imagine the world in which it was built. The people who once raised its walls believed in cycles of life, in the guidance of unseen forces, and in the importance of gathering together to honor powers greater than themselves. Stone by stone, they laid its foundation, aligning it carefully with the sun, the stars, and the turning of the seasons. Every corner was measured not only for strength, but for meaning, for to them architecture was more than shelter. It was a reflection of the world's order. The temple rose slowly, perhaps over years, with labor shared by entire communities. Farmers who worked the fields by day carried stones by evening, craftsmen shaped carvings, and elders oversaw rituals of dedication. When it was finally complete, the people must have looked upon it with pride, for it was not just a building but a space where the visible and the invisible could meet. Within its walls, fires once burned brightly, casting light upon statues of stone or wood, upon painted walls, upon offerings carefully placed by worshippers. Songs rose there, low and rhythmic, carrying words that may now be lost, but whose echoes once filled the air. The scent of incense lingered, heavy and sweet, winding upward into rafters and disappearing into the open sky. Feet pressed against its floors again and again, so many times that the stone itself bore faint marks of wear. For centuries the temple lived, not as a person lives, but as a vessel filled with meaning. Then slowly things began to change. Perhaps the gods worshipped there faded from memory, replaced by new beliefs, or perhaps the people themselves moved away, drawn to cities or to safer lands. Storms may have damaged its roof, wars may have shaken its walls, or famine may have emptied its village. Whatever the reason, the crowds thinned, the offerings grew fewer, the fires dimmed, until one day, without ceremony, the temple simply stood alone. No one tended its altars, no one swept its floors, no one sang within its halls. Silence replaced the rhythm of prayer, Dust gathered on stones once polished by human touch. Birds nested in its eaves, small animals scurried through its corners, and vines began to creep up its outer walls. What was once sacred became ordinary. What was once filled with voices became an echo chamber for wind. And yet, abandoned though it is, the temple did not cease to exist. It remained, as old stones often do, carrying within them the memory of the people who built them. To walk through such a place now, one would feel a stillness different from other ruins. It is not only the absence of people that is felt, but the absence of worship, the absence of meaning once given and now withdrawn. There is a quiet weight to that kind of silence, as though the walls themselves remember. Archaeologists who study such sites often find fragments of pottery, broken statues, worn inscriptions. Each piece is a clue, a whisper of what once was. A cracked vessel may suggest what was offered. A faded carving may hint at which gods were honored. A line of stone may reveal how processions once moved. Piecing these together, they reconstruct stories, but even then, the full picture is incomplete. Some mysteries remain, hidden within the silence of the abandoned temple. To imagine the temple's final day of worship is to picture a gathering smaller than before. Fewer voices rising, fewer feet pressing against the stone. Perhaps an elder gave one last blessing. Perhaps a family left one last offering. Perhaps a final fire burned and then was left to fade. And then the doors closed, not locked, not barred, but simply left behind. From that day, the temple belonged to time itself. It weathered storms, it stood beneath suns and moons, it endured the slow passage of centuries. And still it stands, not alive in the way it once was, but not dead either, for stone endures even when memory does not. In the silence of its halls, in the worn marks of its steps, in the carvings softened by wind, the temple continues to whisper. It whispers of the people who built it, of the voices that filled it, of the meaning that once pulsed through it like breath. Though no one worships there now, though it has been abandoned, the temple remains a reminder of how deeply human beings have always sought to connect with what lies beyond themselves, and how even when forgotten, such places never entirely lose their power. When we step deeper into the story of the abandoned temple, we find that its silence today conceals layers of meaning left behind by the people who once filled it with life. A temple is never simply a structure of stone. It is a record of the hopes, fears, and devotion of those who built it. Every pillar raised, every carving etched into the walls, every offering placed upon its altar, was part of a conversation between people and the unseen powers they believed guided their world. To them, the temple was the heart of their community, a place where individuals came together not only to worship, but to feel part of something greater than themselves. The architecture alone tells us much about their intentions. Stones were not placed carelessly. They were cut, aligned, and positioned to echo celestial movements. Scholars who study abandoned temples often discover that entrances face solstices. Windows frame sunrise on particular days, or columns cast shadows that marked seasonal shifts. This shows us that the builders were not only skilled laborers, but also careful observers of the heavens. The temple was, in essence, a calendar carved into stone, ensuring that their sacred rituals aligned with the turning of the seasons. But the temple was not only about aligning with the stars, it was also about anchoring the daily life of the community. Markets were often held nearby, meetings took place in its courtyards, and festivals radiated outward from its sacred center. Songs sung in its halls were carried home by worshippers and repeated in their daily chores, weaving temple life into ordinary existence. Children grew up hearing these songs, watching ceremonies, and learning to bow before statues whose names we may no longer know. For centuries, the temple breathed in rhythm with the people. Then, gradually, the rhythm faltered. The reasons for abandonment are always many, never singular. Perhaps drought forced families to migrate, or perhaps wars shifted borders and brought new rulers with new gods. Perhaps a disease weakened the community, leaving too few to keep traditions alive. Or perhaps new beliefs spread, drawing worshippers elsewhere. Whatever the cause, the decline would have been gradual, like the slow dimming of a flame. Fewer fires lit the altars, fewer voices echoed against the walls, and fewer offerings filled the courtyards. Eventually, there came a day when no one returned. The silence that followed was not sudden, but inevitable, the final result of years of change. Today, walking through the remains of such a place, one notices small details that tell of its life. Steps worn smooth from countless feet, grooves carved into stone by prout, ropes that once pulled banners or bells, faint pigments that suggest once bright murals. Even in ruin, these details speak. They remind us that the temple was never empty in its time. It was filled with movement, with sound, with breath. And though abandoned, it carries within its silence the memory of those lives. Nature too plays its part in reshaping the temple. With no human hands to tend it, vines creep along its walls, rain seeps into cracks, roots press upward through floors, birds nest in the rafters, insects hum in the corners, and small animals scurry where priests once walked. In this way, the temple has not ceased to live. It has merely changed its congregation. Where once people gathered in devotion, now nature reclaims its space. The gods may have departed, or the people may have ceased to call to them, but the earth itself continues its quiet worship, covering stone with green, softening edges, and folding the temple back into the landscape. There is a strange beauty in this transformation. The temple no longer serves its original purpose, yet it endures as part of the natural order, its silence speaking as clearly as prayers once did. To visit such a place is to feel both presence and absence. Presence in the stones that still stand, holding the shape of belief, and absence in the lack of human voice, the emptiness where ritual once was. Together they create an atmosphere that is haunting yet peaceful, a reminder that nothing is truly lost, only changed. And so the abandoned temple, though empty of worshippers, is not without meaning. It stands as a testament to time, to human devotion, to the inevitability of change, and to the quiet persistence of stone. In its silence, it tells us that what is forgotten by people is still remembered by the earth, and that even without voices, the walls of a temple continue to speak. The story of the abandoned temple is not only about stone walls and empty courtyards. It is about the passage of time itself, about the way human devotion fades and the way silence grows to replace it. To imagine the temple in its prime, one must picture mornings when smoke rose steadily from incense burners, when priests or elders chanted words that echoed through the chambers, when worshippers brought baskets of grain, jars of oil, or offerings of fruit to lay before statues that gleamed in the dim light. The air would have been alive with scent and sound, with footsteps moving rhythmically across floors worn smooth by generations. Light filtered through doorways at certain angles, marking times of the day chosen deliberately by those who designed the building. The temple was more than walls. It was an experience of harmony, a place where architecture and ritual worked together to remind people of their place in the world. But time, like the wind, wears away at even the strongest stone. Slowly, the energy that filled the temple began to wane. At first, the changes may have seemed small, a ceremony with fewer participants, a festival less elaborate than before, a statue left without fresh paint. Then, as years passed, these small declines accumulated. Perhaps new leaders discouraged the old practices, or perhaps younger generations felt less connection to the rituals of their elders. Perhaps famine or drought forced people to focus on survival rather than ceremony. Gradually, the temple lost its central role. Worshippers came less often, fires were lit less frequently, songs faded from memory. Until one day, the temple stood open but unused, its silence broken only by the wind and the call of birds overhead. To walk through its remains now is to walk through layers of history. One might see carvings softened by centuries of weather, columns cracked by roots pressing upward, floors scattered with fragments of pottery. Each fragment tells a story, yet none tell the whole. Archaeologists piece together what they can, tracing the outlines of altars, mapping the dimensions of courtyards, studying the orientation of walls. They find evidence that the temple once aligned with the movements of the sun or the rising of certain stars, suggesting that worship here was not only spiritual but cosmic, tied directly to the great rhythms of the universe. This makes its abandonment all the more striking, a place once linked to the heavens, now surrendered to silence. Yet even in abandonment, the temple is not without life. Nature has made it her own. Moss creeps across the stones, vines trail down from broken arches, small animals find shelter where people once gathered. Rain falls through open roofs, collecting in shallow pools where insects ripple the surface. The sounds that fill the temple now are different but constant. The hum of bees, the chirp of birds, the rustle of leaves. In a sense, worship never truly ended. it only changed form. Where once people sang, now the earth itself continues its quiet hymn. The temple becomes not less sacred but differently sacred, a place where human presence has given way to natural persistence. For visitors who find their way to such ruins today, the feeling is often one of stillness mixed with awe. Standing in an empty hall, one senses the presence of countless lives that passed before. The stones seem to hold memory, the air itself seems heavier, as if carrying whispers of forgotten prayers. It is not difficult to imagine shadows of worshippers moving silently through the corridors. Not ghosts in the frightening sense, but echoes of devotion, reminders that for centuries, this place was filled with meaning. That is the strange paradox of abandoned temples. They are empty yet full, silent yet resonant, forgotten yet unforgettable. The temple no longer serves the people who built it, but it continues to serve as a bridge between past and present. A silent teacher reminding us that all things change, that devotion rises and falls, and that time reshapes even what seems eternal. And so, though no one worships there anymore, the temple endures, carrying within its stones the quiet memory of lives once bound together by faith. When we think of abandoned temples, it is tempting to imagine them as nothing more than ruins, broken and forgotten, yet each stone that remains upright and each carving that still holds its shape is a testimony to lives once devoted to building and maintaining something that felt eternal. This particular temple, though now empty of worshippers, would once have been alive with processions, music, and ritual gestures that brought together entire communities. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight would have streamed through its entrance, casting long shafts of light across the floor, deliberately aligned by its builders so that each season was marked by the angle of illumination. By midday, incense smoke would have filled the interior, curling slowly toward openings in the ceiling, carrying the prayers of the faithful upward to whatever gods or forces they believed watched from above. The temple was more than a structure. It was a stage upon which the cycle of belief was played out again and again, year after year, generation after generation. To step inside during its height would have been to enter a space transformed, where ordinary concerns of survival or labor were set aside, and where people could feel part of a greater whole. Archaeologists who uncover such places often note the details that reveal their significance. Grooves worn into stone steps from countless feet, fragments of statues that once stood tall, pottery shards that hint at offerings placed in reverence. Each small detail is a whisper of the life that filled the temple, a reminder that what appears silent today was once filled with voices, footsteps, and songs. Yet even with such evidence, much is left to the imagination, for the full rituals, the exact words, and the names of deities may be lost forever. What remains is the knowledge that humans once believed so deeply that they shaped stone into forms meant to last centuries, and even when the belief faded, the stone endured. The abandonment of the temple was not likely a single event but a slow process. Seasons changed, rulers shifted, people moved away or adopted new traditions. Perhaps drought made the area less livable, or perhaps invaders disrupted the community. Perhaps younger generations no longer felt the pull of the old gods, turning instead to newer practices that promised more security or more power. Whatever the reason, the decline would have felt gradual to those who lived through it. Fewer festivals, smaller gatherings, altars left without fresh offerings. In time, silence spread, not suddenly but steadily, like the slow encroachment of vines upon the walls. Today, the temple stands as a place of dual identity. On the one hand, it is a ruin, subject to the erosion of wind, rain, and time. On the other hand, it is still a sacred space, though in a different way. Nature has taken the role of worshipper. Birds build nests in its rafters, roots push through its foundations, moss and lichen paint the stones in green and gray. Insects hum in the still air, and at night the moonlight casts shadows where torches once flickered. The temple has become part of the landscape, inseparable from the world around it. In this way, it has not been abandoned completely. It has simply shifted from human hands to the hands of time itself. To visit such a place now is to feel both the absence of people and the presence of the earth. A traveler might pause in its central hall, hearing only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds, yet sensing something profound. The silence is not empty, but heavy, filled with the memory of what once was. Some visitors describe a sensation of being watched, not by gods, but by history itself, as though the stones remember every prayer whispered within them. This feeling is why abandoned temples continue to inspire awe, even after their original purpose has been forgotten. They remind us of the persistence of human devotion and the inevitability of change, of how even the strongest structures eventually yield, but also of how meaning lingers in places long after people have gone. The abandoned temple no longer serves its worshippers, yet it still speaks to us, telling us about their values, their struggles, their hopes. In its silence, it becomes a mirror, reflecting our own awareness of time's passage and reminding us that everything we build is temporary, yet nothing is ever truly lost. To stand before an abandoned temple is to stand at the meeting point of two worlds: the world of the past, where devotion filled every stone with purpose, and the world of the present, where silence has settled into every corner. The contrast between what it was and what it has become is striking, and yet the line between the two is not sudden but gradual. Generations passed between the height of its use and the moment when the last worshipper walked away. During that time, the temple would have shifted slowly from a place of noise and ritual to a place of half-remembered practices and fading songs. At first, perhaps ceremonies became shorter, festivals less crowded, altars less adorned. Then the doors were opened less often, the fires burned less brightly, the statues stood in longer shadows. Until eventually, without intention, the temple was left to the care of no one but the seasons. To imagine this passage is to imagine not only the decline of stone, but the decline of memory. Children who once ran across its courtyards would have grown into adults who no longer visited as often, telling their children less about the gods honored there. Elders who once chanted prayers may have died with no one left to repeat their words. Slowly, the chain of memory was broken, and when memory breaks, even the strongest walls lose their meaning. Yet meaning does not vanish entirely. It shifts. The abandoned temple became something different once the people left it behind. Birds found shelter where banners once hung. Vines reached upward where statues once stood. Rain and sun played across its floors in place of torchlight. The temple was no longer a center of worship, but it became part of the rhythm of nature. Insects buzzed in its cracks, small animals made homes in its corners, and the slow growth of moss and lichen painted its surfaces anew. In this way, the temple did not die. It changed its congregation. Instead of prayers, it received rain. Instead of chants, it received wind. Instead of offerings, it received sunlight and shadow. For those who wander into such ruins today, there is often a feeling of reverence that arises not from religion, but from history. Standing in the empty halls, one senses the weight of lives lived long ago. The air seems thick, as if holding echoes of voices that no longer sound. The silence feels alive, not void, but filled with the invisible presence of memory. Archaeologists describe the sensation when working in such places, noting that even as they measure stones and record carvings, they feel they are walking alongside the ghosts of those who built and used the temple. Not ghosts in the frightening sense, but in the sense of lingering impressions, reminders that devotion once filled these spaces with life. The architecture itself reveals their intentions. Doorways aligned with sunrise on specific days. Altars positioned beneath openings in the ceiling to allow smoke to escape toward the heavens. Columns carved with symbols that reflected the beliefs of the people. Even in ruin, these details endure. They remind us that the temple was built not randomly, but deliberately, with careful thought and spiritual purpose. Though the worship has ceased, the design still whispers of meaning. There is a paradox in such places. They are forgotten yet unforgettable, abandoned yet enduring. The temple stands empty, but it still speaks. It tells us of the people who believed enough to shape stone into sacred forms, of the generations who gathered in its halls, of the inevitable moment when devotion shifted and silence took its place. The temple has outlasted its gods, its priests, its worshippers, and even the language in which prayers were spoken. And yet it remains a monument not only to faith, but to change itself. To visit it is to be reminded that all things pass, yet nothing disappears completely. The voices of the past are gone, but the stones still carry their echo. And in that echo, we hear the rhythm of time itself. The abandoned temple, though silent, continues to tell its story through the language of stone, shadow, and time. For those who study such ruins today, every crack and carving holds meaning. A wall leaning slightly may reveal the direction of the prevailing winds that battered it for centuries. A broken column lying across the courtyard may show how earthquakes or storms once shook the land. Faded pigments on stone fragments hint at the colors that once decorated the temple, reminding us that what we now see as gray or brown was once alive with reds, blues, and golds. To imagine it in its original form is to imagine a space filled not with silence, but with life. A place painted with bright patterns, filled with fragrance from burning incense, and animated by the sound of chants echoing against high ceilings. The people who built it would never have believed that it would one day stand empty, for to them the temple was eternal, a fixed point in their world. They raised its pillars as if they could defy time. They carved its stones as if the gods themselves would always dwell within. And yet, as history teaches us again and again, nothing built by human hands remains unchanged. Centuries passed, and with them came shifts too subtle to notice at first. Families moved away, new rulers brought new gods, younger generations found meaning elsewhere. Slowly, the ceremonies dwindled. A festival that once filled the courtyards became smaller, then ceased altogether. Fires that once burned every evening flickered less often, until they burned no more. The silence crept in gradually, but once it settled, it never left. When the temple was finally abandoned, nature began its quiet work of reclamation. The roof gave way first, allowing rain to fall onto stone floors. Weeds sprouted between cracks, then spread until roots forced stones apart. Birds nested in open beams. Insects swarmed in corners. Animals wandered in and out without fear. The temple became less a house of gods and more a house of earth, sky, and living creatures. Yet even in this new form, the temple retained a kind of sacredness. Its silence was not empty, but weighty, filled with memory. Visitors who step into its shadow often describe a feeling of awe, as if the very stones hold the presence of the countless people who once passed through. Archaeologists, measuring and cataloging, often pause to feel the atmosphere of the place, acknowledging that science alone cannot capture what lingers in such ruins. What is striking is how much of the temple still aligns with the rhythms of nature. Even now, centuries after abandonment, the sunlight still enters through doorways at certain times of the year, casting beams of light across the floor just as it did when priests once stood waiting. The stars still appear above it in their eternal cycles, as they did when festivals were timed by their rising. Though the people are gone, the universe continues to honor the design, reminding us that the builders worked not only with stone, but with the heavens themselves. In this way, the temple has never fully ceased to function. It no longer gathers worshippers, but it still participates in the cycle of nature, still catches the dawn, still reflects the moon, still stands as a marker of time's passage. This endurance is perhaps its greatest lesson. Temples may be abandoned, gods may be forgotten, people may move on, but the stones remain, whispering to anyone who will listen. They remind us that belief, though powerful, is not permanent, and that even silence carries meaning. The abandoned temple no longer echoes with prayer, but in its stillness, it offers something else. A reminder of impermanence, of continuity, of the gentle truth that all things change, yet nothing truly disappears. For as long as the stones remain, the memory of those who built them endures, even if no one remembers their names. And in that endurance, there is a kind of worship still taking place, not by people, but by time itself. The longer we think about the abandoned temple, the more we begin to see it not simply as a forgotten ruin, but as a witness to the passage of centuries. Its stones have seen countless suns rise and set, countless seasons turn, countless storms break and then pass. While people came and went, the temple remained, its walls absorbing the silence left behind. And in that silence, the temple itself becomes a storyteller. It speaks not in words but in details. The grooves on steps where countless feet once walked, the worn threshold where doors once swung open, the faint outlines of carvings that once depicted gods, now softened into near abstract shapes by wind and rain. Each mark is a chapter, each scar a reminder of the hands that once shaped the building with belief in their hearts. To walk through its spaces is to walk through time itself. The central hall, once filled with smoke and song, is now open to the sky. Birds perch where banners once hung, and vines curl down like forgotten decorations. Courtyards that once rang with the sound of drums and flutes now echo only with the call of insects. The silence is heavy but not empty, for it carries the weight of memory, the weight of lives lived and prayers whispered. Archaeologists have long studied temples like this one, and though their tools are scientific, many admit to feeling a strange presence in such spaces. They measure dimensions, sketch diagrams, and analyze fragments, yet they often pause in quiet recognition that what they study is not merely stone, but the remnant of human spirit. The temple itself is a paradox, abandoned yet enduring, forgotten yet unforgettable, silent yet filled with echoes. And perhaps it is this paradox that continues to give it meaning, even without worshippers. What is particularly striking is how the temple still aligns with the natural world. Centuries after it was left behind, the sun still passes through its doorways at certain times of year, casting beams of light exactly as the builders intended. The moon still rises above its roof, tracing the same path across the sky. Stars still shine down upon its courtyards, the same stars that once guided rituals and festivals. Though people no longer gather to watch, the temple continues to perform its silent dialogue with the heavens. In this way, it has never fully stopped serving its purpose. The gods may be forgotten, but the universe still answers. Nature has also reclaimed the temple in ways both destructive and beautiful. Cracks widen as roots press upward, yet those same roots keep some walls upright by holding stones together. Rain has eroded carvings, yet in doing so, it has softened them into shapes that resemble waves or flowing cloth, as if the stone itself had become alive. Birds have stained walls with their nests, but their songs now fill the air once occupied by chants. The temple has transformed from a house of human worship into a sanctuary of the natural world, proving that spaces do not lose meaning when abandoned. They simply gain new forms of life. For modern visitors who step into the ruins, the sensation can be overwhelming. The air feels cooler, the light dimmer, the silence deeper. One feels the presence of generations who once stood there, even if their names and prayers are lost. It is not difficult to imagine processions passing through the same halls centuries ago, or to hear in the mind the echoes of flutes and drums that once resonated from these stones. In such moments, the temple reminds us that memory is not only in books or inscriptions, but in the very places themselves, places that continue to hold traces of what once was. And so, the abandoned temple becomes more than a ruin. It becomes a meditation on time, on change, on the persistence of stone and the fragility of memory. It tells us that no belief, no matter how powerful, is immune to time's erosion, and yet no belief ever disappears completely, for traces remain in stone, in soil, in silence. Though no one worships there now, the temple endures, a silent witness, a patient storyteller, a monument not only to gods and people, but to the rhythm of the world itself. When one reflects on the abandoned temple, it becomes clear that its silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a presence in itself, a kind of atmosphere that lingers in every shadowed corner and broken stone. To the people who once gathered there, the temple was the beating heart of their spiritual life. They believed that within its walls they could reach the divine, that the chants and offerings lifted into the air would carry their hopes to powers greater than themselves. Now, centuries later, the same walls remain, but their purpose has shifted. Where once there was the rhythm of human devotion, there is now the rhythm of nature, slower, quieter, yet equally persistent. Archaeologists exploring such sites often remark on how the orientation of these temples was never random. They were aligned with the path of the sun, the rise of the moon, or the turning of the stars, and even after generations have passed, those alignments still hold. At certain times of year, the dawn still pours its light directly into the central hall, casting long beams across the floor. At certain nights, the moon still rises exactly where the builders intended, flooding the courtyard with silver light. These cosmic connections endure even when people do not, and in that endurance we are reminded of the builders' devotion and knowledge. Though their gods are forgotten, the heavens continue to honor the design. Yet it is not only the cosmos that remains in dialogue with the temple. The earth itself has reclaimed it, transforming it into something both ruin and sanctuary. Roots press between the stones, some widening cracks, others holding walls upright. Moss paints the surfaces green, while lichen creates subtle patterns across faded carvings. Small trees sprout in corners where soil has gathered, and animals wander freely where once only priests walked. Birds sing where once prayers were chanted, and the sound of rain dripping through the broken roof is a hymn of its own. In this way, the temple is not truly abandoned. It has simply been given new life, a new kind of congregation composed not of people but of the natural world. Travelers who visit often describe a sense of calm, as if stepping into a space where time has slowed. The air is cooler, the light softer, the silence deeper. One can stand in the center of the hall and feel the centuries press inward, not in a way that frightens, but in a way that humbles. It is easy to imagine the people who once filled this place, their songs echoing, their fires burning, their hands placing offerings. The memory lingers in the stones, and though no voices remain, the impression is strong enough that one almost hears them still. For historians, such ruins are invaluable because they capture a way of life that has vanished. Every fragment uncovered, whether a broken pot, a faded carving, or a worn threshold, tells us something about the people who built and used the temple. We learn how they organized their society, how they measured time, how they sought to connect with the sacred. And yet, for those who experience the temple outside of scholarship, it is not only knowledge that matters but feeling. The temple inspires reflection, a reminder of impermanence, a meditation on how all things built by human hands eventually return to the earth. What makes the abandoned temple remarkable is that even in its decay, it continues to serve a purpose. It no longer connects people to gods, but it connects us to time itself. It shows us the arc of history, the endurance of stone, the fragility of memory, and the resilience of nature. It reminds us that silence has its own power, that even when devotion ceases, meaning lingers. And so, though no one worships there now, the temple still teaches. It teaches us about the people who raised it, about the forces of time and nature that reshaped it, and about the truth that nothing is truly lost. In its stillness, it speaks more softly than chants or prayers, but the message endures. The abandoned temple is not only a monument of stone, but a monument of silence, a silence that has lasted longer than the voices of those who once filled its halls. It is difficult for us now to imagine how central it was to the community that built it, because when we see it, we see only walls broken and courtyards overgrown. Yet if we allow ourselves to listen with imagination, the silence begins to reveal what was once there. The worn steps tell us of countless feet climbing them. The soot marks tell us of fires lit night after night. The faint carvings tell us of hands that worked with patience and devotion. These details are not just remnants, they are stories frozen in stone. Archaeologists studying the site often try to reconstruct what the rituals may have looked like. They point to the orientation of the building towards certain stars, to the alignment of doorways with solstices, to the placement of altars in positions that caught light at exact moments of the year. All of this shows us that the temple was not random. It was a deliberate design to connect heaven and earth. And so for centuries, it served its purpose, to give people a place to reach for the divine, to gather in shared belief, to feel united under powers they trusted. But when belief shifted, the temple shifted too. Without worshippers, its role changed. Slowly, without human hands to tend it, nature entered. First came the wind, moving through open doorways, then rain, seeping into cracks, then vines, pressing into stone and spreading across walls. Animals began to pass through, leaving their marks as well. In time, the temple no longer belonged to people, but to the earth itself. Yet abandonment does not mean disappearance. The temple remains, altered but still present, silent but still speaking. For modern visitors, the effect is often profound. To stand in the central hall, open now to the sky, is to feel the weight of centuries pressing downward. The sunlight still falls in the same places it once did. Stars still wheel above in their eternal cycles. And though no one gathers to honor them, the alignment of the building continues to acknowledge the heavens. The temple is no longer filled with sound, but it is still filled with meaning. Nature has turned it into something new. Moss paints the walls, turning gray stone into green surfaces. Roots grip columns and sometimes hold them upright when they might otherwise fall. Birds nest where banners once hung, their calls filling the air with music different but no less persistent than the chants of long ago. The temple has become a sanctuary, not for gods, but for life itself, a place where earth and sky meet in quiet harmony. In this way, the abandoned temple has not ceased to function. It has simply changed its congregation. The worshippers are gone, but the temple still gathers the elements, still welcomes the sun, the rain, the moon, the stars. It has become a participant in the slow, eternal rhythm of the natural world. For historians, it is evidence of a civilization's devotion. For travelers, it is a place of reflection. For nature, it is a home. And for time itself, it is a marker, a reminder of how things rise, how they flourish, and how they fade. There is something deeply calming in this truth. The temple shows us that even when human hands let go, the world carries on. And even when memory fades, stone remembers. To walk away from such a place is to carry a quiet lesson, that nothing lasts forever, but nothing is ever fully lost either. The temple still stands, empty yet enduring, abandoned yet alive, forgotten by people but remembered by the earth. As the story of the abandoned temple draws to a close, we are reminded that what we see today, its ruin, was once the heart of a living world. The temple stood not only as a place of worship, but as a symbol of unity, of knowledge, and of devotion. Families gathered in its courtyards, priests raised their voices within its chambers, and entire communities wove their lives around its ceremonies. To them, it was not simply stone and mortar, it was the center of their connection to the divine. When the temple was first built, its creators surely imagined it would endure forever, a permanent home for their gods and their people. They aligned it carefully with the heavens, carved it with skill, and filled it with ritual. For generations it fulfilled its role, and its walls held the memory of countless prayers. But time, relentless and impartial, reshaped its destiny. Slowly the voices grew fewer, the fires burned less often, and the rituals became memories. Eventually the temple stood alone, its doors open only to the wind, its altars cold, its statues weathered. What once belonged to the people now belonged to silence. Yet in that silence, the temple did not cease to have meaning. It became something else, something beyond the purpose first imagined by its builders. Nature entered and claimed it, birds nesting in the rafters, roots pressing into cracks, rain filling the air with the sound of dripping water. The sun still passed through its doorways, the stars still traced their patterns above, and the moon still lit its courtyards. The temple no longer belonged to gods or people. It belonged to time itself. To walk among its stones now is to walk within layers of memory. Each wall holds an echo, each column a whisper. Archaeologists uncover fragments and try to piece together the story, but the temple speaks in a language beyond science, a language of atmosphere, of silence, of presence. Visitors who step into its shadow often describe a feeling of awe, as though they are not alone, as though the stones themselves remember. And perhaps they do, for the temple carries within its endurance the weight of belief, the persistence of human devotion, and the inevitability of change. What is most striking is how the temple, though abandoned, continues to teach. It teaches us that nothing we build is permanent, yet everything we build leaves traces. It teaches us that devotion may fade, but meaning lingers. It teaches us that silence can be as powerful as song, that nature reclaims, but also preserves, and that even in ruin, beauty endures. The temple is no longer a place where people gather to worship, yet it has become a place where people gather to remember, to reflect, to feel the passage of centuries in the air around them. And so the abandoned temple is not dead, but transformed. It stands as a monument not only to faith, but to time, not only to people, but to the earth itself. In its silence, it holds the memory of what once was, and the promise that nothing is ever truly lost. As long as its stones remain, the temple continues its quiet work, bridging past and present, human and nature, memory and forgetting. It whispers to us that all things change, that all things pass, but that in passing they leave behind a story, a lesson, a presence. And so, though no one worships there anymore, the temple still has its congregation, those who listen to its silence, those who walk its halls, those who feel its weight. In the end, the abandoned temple is not only about what was left behind, it is about what continues. It is about endurance, about transformation, about the quiet power of time. And in this way, it remains sacred, not to gods but to history, not to rituals but to memory, not to a people long gone but to everyone who stands before it now. And so, our old story has come to an end. Before we move on, if you've enjoyed this quiet journey, please give this video a like and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps these calm stories continue. Now, let us drift gently into the next tale in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we begin the gentle collapse of a forgotten empire. When we think of empires, we often imagine strength, expansion, armies marching in step, rulers seated on thrones, and banners flying over distant lands. Empires are built on power, on organization, on the ability to control vast territories and diverse peoples. Yet history tells us that no empire, no matter how strong, lasts forever. Some fall with violence, their capitals burned and their rulers overthrown. Others, however, do not collapse in fire and sudden destruction, but in a quieter way, fading slowly, gently, almost without notice, until centuries later, we look back and realize the empire is gone. Tonight we begin the story of one such empire, one that once stood tall, commanding trade routes, shaping culture, and influencing lands far beyond its borders, yet whose decline was not marked by a single battle or catastrophe, but by the gradual turning of time. To imagine this forgotten empire, one must first picture its beginnings. It likely began as a small settlement along a river or coast, where fertile land and access to trade allowed it to grow. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and with cities came walls, markets, temples, and palaces. Farmers worked the fields, artisans shaped tools and ornaments, traders carried goods across seas and mountains. Slowly, authority concentrated in the hands of rulers who claimed divine favor or ancestral right. An empire was born, not overnight, but over centuries of steady growth, as power expanded outward and wealth flowed inward. At its height, this empire would have seemed unshakable. Roads connected its provinces, armies patrolled its borders, scribes recorded its decrees, and priests performed ceremonies in its temples. People living within its boundaries may have thought it would last forever, as people often do when they live in the middle of greatness. And yet beneath the surface, change was always at work. Empires carry within them the seeds of their own decline, for the larger they grow, the more difficult they become to sustain. The forgotten empire we speak of began to weaken not through one great disaster, but through many small ones. Crops failed in some years, trade routes shifted as new powers rose elsewhere, taxes grew heavier to fund distant wars, and discontent slowly spread among common people. These were not dramatic events, but ordinary struggles, the kind that seem manageable in the moment, but accumulate over time until the foundation begins to crack. Archaeologists tell us that signs of decline are often subtle. Pottery becomes less refined, building materials less durable, inscriptions less frequent. The energy of a thriving culture begins to fade, replaced by a quieter rhythm of survival. This empire's decline was like that. Gradual, gentle, hardly noticed at first. Cities that once bustled with trade became quieter, streets less crowded, markets less abundant. Palaces still stood, but their halls were less filled. Armies still marched, but with fewer men. Temples still held ceremonies, but with smaller crowds. Life continued, but with a little less vigor, a little less certainty, each passing year. For those who lived through it, the decline may not have felt like collapse at all. They woke each day, tended their fields, worked their crafts, raised their children, and looked to their rulers. The empire was still there, its walls still standing, its banners still flying, but slowly, gently, its strength drained away. It is only in hindsight, looking across centuries, that we call it collapse. To the people themselves, it was life as usual, until the day came when they realized that the empire they had known was no longer what it once was. The gentle collapse of this forgotten empire is a reminder that history does not always change with a crash. Sometimes it changes with a whisper, with a gradual fading, with the slow turning of the seasons. And in that gentle fading, there is a lesson for us even now, that nothing is permanent, not even greatness. and that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen quietly, beneath notice, until only silence remains. Where once there was power. The forgotten empire, like all great powers, carried within itself the contradictions that would eventually lead to its decline. On the surface, it appeared stable, with rulers issuing decrees, armies patrolling borders, and merchants filling markets with goods from near and far. The monuments of the capital city stood tall, columns rising into the sky, palaces decorated with carvings and painted walls that told the story of victories and divine favor. Visitors from distant lands would have been impressed, even awed, by its size and wealth. Yet beneath this display of grandeur, small shifts were beginning. Farmers in outlying regions struggled when the climate changed, rains failing to arrive on time or arriving too heavily, washing away crops. When harvests grew unreliable, food prices rose, and with them the burden on the poor. To compensate, rulers increased taxes, demanding grain or labor to keep the empire supplied. At first, people complied, but over time resentment grew, quiet but persistent, spreading like cracks in stone that slowly widened year by year. Trade, too, began to falter. Routes that once guaranteed prosperity became less certain as new powers rose in neighboring regions. Merchants who once brought luxury goods began to travel elsewhere, seeking better profits. Markets grew quieter, and with them, the wealth that once flowed into the empire diminished. Armies still marched, but now more to enforce loyalty at home than to expand abroad. Soldiers once celebrated as defenders of the realm became a burden on the people who fed them. The temples remained open, and priests continued their ceremonies, but even here the signs of decline could be felt. Offerings became fewer, decorations less elaborate, repairs less frequent. Murals faded, roofs leaked, statues stood unattended. Worship continued, but with a sense of habit more than fervor, a ritual repeated without the same depth of belief. To those living within the empire, life still carried on, but it carried on with a heaviness. Generations who grew up during this time may not have realized they were living through decline at all. Children played in streets, families gathered for meals, festivals were still held, though smaller than before. The empire was still their world, and they accepted it as it was. Yet from the wider view of history, we can see how each year chipped away at its strength, how the edges of the empire grew weaker, how the center became less able to hold. Archaeologists looking back find evidence of this gentle decline in the smallest of details. Pottery once crafted with intricate patterns became plainer. Stonework once precise became rougher. Inscriptions once boasting of conquests became rare. Records grew fewer, as though even the scribes lost the energy to keep writing. What we see is not a dramatic end, but a long unwinding, like a thread pulled slowly from a woven cloth until the fabric loosens. And yet, for all its decline, the empire did not vanish overnight. It lingered, as empires often do, in memory as much as in fact. Even as its power weakened, people continued to live within its shadow, using its roads, trading in its markets, and telling stories of its former greatness. The banners still flew, though tattered. The palaces still stood, though quieter. The sense of belonging to something vast endured long after the strength of that vastness had faded. This is the gentle collapse of a forgotten empire, not fire and conquest, not sudden destruction, but a slow fading, so gradual that those who lived through it may not have noticed until the end had already passed. And in that fading lies a reminder for us that greatness is not always lost in noise, that decline is not always marked by catastrophe. Sometimes it happens softly, in the everyday struggles of ordinary people, in the slow erosion of wealth and will, in the quiet surrender of once mighty walls to time. As the forgotten empire drifted further into decline, the signs became more visible, though never sudden or catastrophic. Its great capital, once a hub of trade and ceremony, began to lose its shine. Streets that had been crowded with merchants from across distant lands grew quieter. Warehouses that once overflowed with goods stood half empty. Palaces that once resounded with the music of festivals held fewer gatherings, and their walls, once bright with fresh paint and polished stone, began to show cracks left untended. Yet life did not stop. People still walked those streets, still opened their market stalls, still prayed in temples. The difference was one of scale and energy. a fading of vigor rather than a collapse of existence. For those living through it, this decline was subtle, almost invisible. A child born during this time would have grown up knowing only a quieter city, smaller festivals, fewer goods, and less grandeur. To them, it was simply life, not decline. Only those old enough to remember the empire's height would have felt the change deeply, recalling with nostalgia the bustling streets and crowded ceremonies of their youth. They may have told stories of the greatness that once was, but their children would have listened with disbelief, unable to imagine that the faded palaces around them had once shone so brightly. In the countryside, the empire's reach weakened further. Provinces once tightly controlled became looser in their loyalty. Local leaders, sensing the slow retreat of central power, began to govern more independently. Taxes were sent less frequently, decrees enforced less strongly, and the empire's great system of order slowly unraveled into a patchwork of semi-independent regions. Yet even this did not happen with rebellion or violence. It happened gently, with people simply ceasing to rely on the empire, and instead turning to their own local systems for support. Archaeologists see this stage of decline in the layers of settlement. Towns that once imported fine pottery began to make simpler, local versions. Buildings that once followed imperial designs shifted to regional styles. Coins from the capital grew scarcer, replaced by local currencies or barter systems. Trade networks that once tied the empire together dissolved slowly, leaving communities more isolated, but also more self-sufficient. The empire had not collapsed entirely, but its unity had faded like the colors of a mural left in the sun. Even religion, once a unifying force, began to fragment. Temples that had been supported by imperial wealth lost their grandeur. Priests still performed rituals, but with fewer resources and smaller congregations. The gods themselves seemed quieter, their statues unpolished, their offerings fewer. Belief persisted, but without the empire's power behind it, the scale of worship diminished. This gentle withdrawal of divine presence mirrored the empire's own retreat. Yet what is remarkable about this stage of history is how resilient ordinary life remained. Families still planted crops, still raised children, still held festivals, even if on a smaller scale. The empire was fading, but life itself was not. This is why the collapse was so gentle, because it was not the end of people, but the end of a system, a way of organizing power and wealth that had simply grown too heavy to sustain. To the outside world, the empire's fading influence may have been obvious. Neighboring powers grew stronger, trade routes shifted away, and what had once been the heart of a vast network became only another land among many. Yet for those inside, the decline was lived slowly, day by day, season by season, too gradual to notice until the empire existed more in memory than in reality. In this way, the gentle collapse of the forgotten empire was less a fall than a transformation. It slipped quietly into history, leaving behind ruins, inscriptions, and artifacts that tell us of its greatness, and a silence that tells us of its end. And within that silence lies a lesson. That decline does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and in its whisper we hear the truth of time's steady hand. The slow unraveling of the forgotten empire can be traced not only in the fading of its monuments and the quieting of its cities, but also in the shifting patterns of everyday life. As central authority weakened, communities began to turn inward, relying less on imperial roads, imperial markets, and imperial protection. Villages that once looked to the capital for guidance started to look instead to their own elders or local leaders. This was not rebellion but adaptation, a gradual change that unfolded so gently that many may not have noticed its significance. In the countryside, fields were still planted, harvests still gathered, and festivals still held. But the empire's stamp upon these activities grew lighter. Where once taxes and tithes claimed a portion of the harvest, now more of it remained in the villages. Where once imperial decrees dictated practices, now traditions adapted to local needs. This created a kind of quiet independence, one born not of resistance but of necessity, as the empire's hand grew weaker with each passing generation. In the cities, too, the signs of decline were subtle but clear. The wide avenues once filled with processions became less traveled. The markets once overflowing with exotic goods became more modest. The palaces once bustling with court officials became quieter. The empire's rulers still held ceremonies, still issued decrees, still wore the symbols of power, but their reach extended less and less beyond the walls of the capital. Scribes who once chronicled every victory and decree began to write less. Their tablets or scrolls fewer in number, their inscriptions shorter and more practical. The grandeur of empire gave way to the practicality of survival. Archaeologists uncovering these layers find evidence of this transition. Fine pottery gives way to rougher, utilitarian wear. Grand architecture is replaced by simpler, sturdier homes. Inscriptions grow scarce, and coinage becomes irregular. The signs of a once vast system are still there, but in muted form, as if the empire itself were whispering rather than speaking aloud. The temples, once the center of belief and unity, mirrored this decline. Altars that had once overflowed with offerings grew sparse. Statues that once gleamed with fresh paint and gold leaf faded into dull stone. Rituals continued, but with smaller crowds, fewer priests, less grandeur. Belief persisted, but without the support of imperial wealth and energy, it shifted into quieter forms, passed down within families rather than celebrated in great ceremonies. For the people themselves, life continued with remarkable steadiness. A farmer still rose with the sun, tended his fields, and cared for his family. A craftsman still shaped clay into vessels, or wood into tools. A mother still told stories to her children by firelight. The empire might fade, but life endured. This is the essence of the gentle collapse, that the structure of empire dissolved, but human existence carried on, adjusting to the changes almost without pause. From the perspective of history, we see decline, but from the perspective of those living it, they saw continuity. For neighboring powers, however, the empire's weakness created opportunity. Trade routes shifted, alliances formed, and new centers of influence rose. Slowly, the empire that had once commanded respect became only one among many, no longer dominant, no longer central. Yet even in its fading, it retained a kind of dignity. It did not fall in flames or chaos, but in silence and endurance. Its story written not in destruction, but in transformation. And so the forgotten empire slipped quietly into history, its grandeur reduced to fragments, its power replaced by memory. What remains is not only the story of decline, but also the story of resilience. The resilience of ordinary people, of nature reclaiming spaces, of memory persisting even when names are forgotten. This is why we call it a gentle collapse, because it was not an end but a slow passage, a fading echo, a reminder that time moves not always with noise, but often with silence. The forgotten empire's decline was marked not by sudden disaster, but by the gradual erosion of the structures that had once made it strong. Its greatness had been built on trade, agriculture, administration, and belief. And as each of these pillars weakened, the whole slowly lost its strength. Trade networks shifted as merchants sought safer or more profitable routes elsewhere. Neighboring states that once relied on the empire's protection began to forge their own alliances. Provinces that had once been tightly bound to the capital grew more independent, their loyalty more symbolic than real. The rulers still sat upon their thrones, still wore crowns, still held ceremonies, but the authority behind these symbols grew lighter with each passing generation. In the countryside, the decline was experienced in subtle but tangible ways. Roads once maintained by imperial workers fell into disrepair, bridges weakened, and travel became slower and less reliable. Farmers continued to till the soil, but without the infrastructure that had once moved their goods swiftly to markets. Their lives became more local, their outlook narrower. The empire's reach was shrinking not because of conquest or rebellion, but because of neglect, because the energy required to hold such vast lands together could no longer be sustained. In the cities, evidence of this gentle collapse is found in the layers of construction and abandonment. Archaeologists uncover grand buildings built in the empire's height, followed by smaller, simpler structures built from the rubble of those earlier monuments. Markets that once thrived with exotic goods show fewer imports in later years, replaced by local wares. The very bones of the city tell the story. First expansion, then contraction, then quiet endurance. The temples, once filled with song and ritual, also reflected the empire's decline. Fewer offerings meant less ability to maintain the grandeur of ceremonies. Priests continued their roles, but with reduced resources. Statues stood unpolished, altars unrepaired. Murals faded under the wear of time. Worship did not vanish, but it became humbler, more personal, carried out within households rather than in great public gatherings. Even the gods seemed to retreat into silence, as if reflecting the empire's own fading power. Yet despite all this, the collapse was not felt as catastrophe by most of those who lived through it. Farmers still rose with the dawn, merchants still bartered in the markets, families still gathered around meals, and children still played in the streets. For them, life was not the story of decline, but the story of continuity. They adapted quietly to a world that was slowly changing, and in doing so, they ensured survival. This is why the collapse was gentle, because it happened not with fire and destruction, but with the soft adjustments of daily life. For outside powers, however, the shift was more visible. Territories that once feared the empire's armies began to test its borders, sensing its weakness. Traders who once traveled its roads turned to new markets, diminishing its wealth. The empire that had once commanded respect became a quieter presence, overshadowed by new centers of power. Its memory lived longer than its influence, as stories of its greatness were told even when its authority had already waned. What remains for us today are ruins, inscriptions, and artifacts, traces of a world that believed it would last forever, but that, like all human creations, yielded to time. The gentle collapse of the forgotten empire teaches us that not all endings are violent. Some are quiet, unfolding slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day the empire that seemed eternal exists only in memory. And within that memory lies its true endurance. For though the empire itself faded, its lessons remain. That power is fragile, that time is stronger than stone, and that even in silence, the past continues to whisper. The gentle collapse of the forgotten empire was felt most clearly in the rhythm of daily life, for it is in the ordinary patterns of existence that great changes are truly recorded. While rulers continued to sit on their thrones and scribes continued to carve inscriptions proclaiming stability, the reality beneath those symbols shifted quietly. Villages that once depended on imperial caravans now lived more from their own harvests. Craftsmen who once shaped goods for distant markets began to work only for local needs. Soldiers who once defended borders were seen more often in the capital, guarding the seats of power rather than the edges of the empire. This inward turning was not dramatic but steady, like a tide receding so gradually that only when the shore is bare do we realize how much water has slipped away. Farmers carried the heaviest weight of this transformation. They were still expected to provide grain and labor, but the imperial roads that carried their goods to distant cities were crumbling. Transport grew slower, less reliable, and less profitable. Taxes remained heavy, leaving resentment in their wake. Many farmers began to withdraw from the empire's larger system, selling locally or bartering, relying on their neighbors rather than distant officials. The empire still existed in name, but in practice, its control weakened with every season. The cities reflected this change in quieter ways. Once crowded marketplaces now sold simpler wares. Grand buildings were left unrepaired, their stones reused for humbler structures. The once elaborate decorations of palaces faded as funds dwindled. Festivals became less extravagant, their music softer, their gatherings smaller. What had once been a show of wealth and authority became modest echoes of past greatness. To the citizens, life continued, but they could sense that their empire no longer radiated the same power. Religion, too, reflected the transformation. Temples still stood, but they grew quieter. Priests performed ceremonies, but with fewer attendants and simpler rituals. The gods had not been abandoned, but they were worshipped with less grandeur, as families kept traditions alive in private, rather than in public spectacle. The great ceremonies that once unified the empire gave way to smaller, more intimate expressions of faith. Belief did not vanish, but it changed shape, becoming personal rather than imperial. Archaeologists uncovering the ruins of this forgotten empire often remark on the way its material culture tells the story of decline more clearly than any inscription. Pottery grows rougher, buildings simpler, coins scarcer. The luxury of abundance gave way to the practicality of survival. It was not the collapse of life, but the simplification of it. The people endured, even as the empire weakened. And that endurance is why its decline was so gentle. For those living through it, the empire's fading power may not have felt like an ending at all. It was simply life as they knew it, Children born during these years would have grown up never knowing the grandeur of earlier generations. To them, the smaller festivals, the quieter markets, the plainer goods were normal. Only the elders, remembering the bustling cities and grand ceremonies of their youth, would have noticed the difference and spoken of how things were before. The empire did not fall in one moment. It dissolved across lifetimes. From the outside, neighboring powers would have seen it more clearly. They watched as the empire's armies weakened, as its borders softened, as its wealth diminished. Trade shifted to other routes, alliances formed elsewhere, and new centers of power rose. What had once been dominant became only another land among many, no longer feared, no longer central. And yet, even in decline, the empire retained dignity. Its monuments, though faded, still stood. Its traditions, though quieter, still survived. Its people, though less connected, still endured. This was not collapse in the fiery sense, but transformation in the quiet sense, a reminder that time wears down even the greatest of structures, not always with violence, but often with silence. In that silence lies the lesson of the forgotten empire, that nothing is eternal, yet nothing is ever entirely lost. The story of the forgotten empire's decline is perhaps best understood not through the grand events that fill chronicles, but through the small, ordinary changes that fill the lives of its people. Empires are built by armies, rulers, and wealth, but they are sustained by farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and families. And it was in their daily lives that the collapse revealed itself most gently. A farmer might rise before dawn, as his father had done, and walk out to fields that stretched beyond his sight. Yet where once caravans came to carry away the grain for distant cities, now the grain was stored in local granaries or exchanged in nearby markets. The empire's officials, who once came regularly to collect taxes or enforce decrees, now appeared less often, and when they did, their demands carried less weight. Over time, the farmer came to feel that his life was tied less to the distant capital and more to the rhythms of his own village. For him, the empire's decline was not a tragedy, but simply a shift in who he answered to. A craftsman in the city might have felt it differently. Where once he produced fine pottery or delicate ornaments for wealthy patrons, now he shaped simpler vessels for everyday use. The demand for luxury had faded, as fewer merchants arrived with the wealth of distant lands. His work remained valuable, but its purpose had changed. He no longer created for an empire that stretched across borders, but for neighbors, families, and local leaders. His skill survived, but the grandeur it once supported had quietly dissolved. Even in the empire's heart, within the capital itself, the signs were evident. Palaces stood, but their walls bore cracks. Ceremonies were still held, but with fewer attendants and less spectacle. The grandeur remained as memory, but memory is lighter than reality, and the weight of history could not keep the halls filled. Priests still lit fires on temple altars, but the smoke rose into emptier spaces. The gods had not been abandoned, but the scale of their worship had diminished. Rituals continued more out of habit than conviction, and the silence between chants grew longer. Archaeologists who study the remnants of this empire see its fading strength written in stone and clay. The shift from intricate designs to plain forms, from bold inscriptions to sparse markings, from monumental architecture to modest dwellings, all tell the story of a people who adjusted as their empire receded. This was not the collapse of a world, but the contraction of one, as the vast networks that had once tied them together unraveled thread by thread. And yet, for those who lived within it, life remained steady. Children still laughed, lovers still met, families still gathered around fires at night. The empire's fall was not the end of life, but the end of scale. What had been vast became local. What had been centralized became scattered. What had been empire became community. This is why its collapse was gentle, because the people adapted quietly, carrying on with their lives as the structures around them shifted. From the perspective of history, we see the decline clearly. We see the maps shrinking, the inscriptions fading, the monuments crumbling. But for those who lived within it, they saw only continuity. Their lives went on, with or without the empire. And perhaps this is the truest lesson the forgotten empire offers us, that what we call collapse is often only transformation. a shift from one way of organizing life to another. The empire may have disappeared, but its people endured, and through their endurance, its story still whispers to us today. The Forgotten Empire, in its slow decline, offers us a picture of how greatness does not always vanish in a moment of fire or conquest, but often dissolves gradually, like mist lifted by the sun. Its decline was experienced not as catastrophe, but as a thinning, a steady softening of the structures that once bound it together. To understand this, imagine the empire not as a single force, but as a network of threads. Threads of trade, governance, faith, and culture that once held firm but slowly loosened. When the threads frayed, the fabric did not tear violently. It unraveled quietly, leaving behind smaller pieces still whole in themselves, but no longer woven into one. Trade was among the first of these threads to weaken. Caravans that once brought wealth from distant lands began to take new routes, bypassing the empire's cities. Ships that once filled its harbors turned to other coasts. Markets that had overflowed with spices, metals, cloth, and pottery grew sparse. This change was not sudden. Merchants simply followed opportunities, as they always do, and slowly the empire's role as a center of exchange diminished. Local goods still moved, but the abundance of earlier centuries faded, leaving its cities quieter, its economy more inward. Governance too lost its reach. The officials who once traveled from the capital to provinces became fewer. Roads fell into disrepair, bridges weakened, posts of authority were left unfilled. Local leaders, once loyal servants of the empire, began to act more independently, their allegiance to the capital more symbolic than real. Taxes once sent faithfully to the center were increasingly kept for local use. The empire still proclaimed itself whole, but in practice it was fragmenting. Faith, once a unifying element, reflected this fragmentation. Grand temples were still visited, but with fewer worshippers, fewer offerings, less ceremony. Priests continued their chants, but the gods seemed less present as the empire's power waned. Families carried their traditions quietly within their homes, keeping belief alive in smaller, more personal ways rather than in public festivals. The great processions faded into memory, and religion shifted from imperial scale to domestic devotion. Culture too adapted. The arts that once flourished under patronage of wealthy rulers became simpler, more modest. Music that once filled palaces with grandeur was replaced by folk songs sung in villages. Inscriptions once carved boldly into stone became rarer, less elaborate, written with fewer words. The empire's voice grew quieter even in its creativity, speaking less to posterity and more to the present needs of ordinary life. Archaeologists piecing together these details see the signs clearly: the rougher pottery, the plainer architecture, the dwindling inscriptions. But for the people themselves, this was life. They were not aware of collapse. They were aware of change. They still ate, worked, prayed, and lived. And the empire's fading grandeur did not mean the fading of their existence, only the shrinking of its reach. The empire's gentle collapse was, in truth, a return to smaller scales of life. The great machine of empire loosened, but the pulse of human living continued. From the perspective of time, this is perhaps the most enduring lesson, that history's grand narratives of rise and fall are felt by people in the softest of ways, not as headlines or turning points, but as the slow reshaping of their everyday routines. To us, centuries later, the Forgotten Empire is a story of decline. But to those who lived through it, it was simply the world as they knew it, quietly shifting until one day they realized that the empire was no longer what it once had been. And in that realization, they carried forward not ruin, but continuity, a reminder that even as empires fade, life endures, and time moves gently on. The gentle collapse of the Forgotten Empire was not a single event, but a long twilight, stretching across generations, in which the grandeur of its past slowly gave way to the quieter rhythms of survival. To imagine this twilight is to picture a city that once stood at the center of power, its avenues filled with processions, its temples bright with offerings, its palaces echoing with music and command. Now the same city stands quieter. The streets are still walked, but less crowded. The markets are still open, but the goods are humbler. The palaces are still there, but their walls show cracks, and their courtyards are less filled. Life continues, but without the same weight of majesty. It is in this way that empires fade, not by sudden disappearance, but by thinning, like the fading of a color until only a pale shadow remains. For the people who lived through it, this fading was almost invisible. A farmer still sowed and harvested. A craftsman still shaped tools. A mother still told stories to her children by the fire. These rhythms did not end because the empire weakened. They endured, adjusting quietly to the shifting circumstances. What the farmer noticed was that fewer caravans came down the roads, fewer taxes were collected, fewer officials appeared with orders from the capital. What the craftsman noticed was that his goods no longer reached distant lands, but remained within local markets. What the priest noticed was that fewer people gathered for great ceremonies, and the offerings grew smaller. These were small changes, yet together they told the larger story of decline. Archaeologists reading this story in the earth see the same pattern. Fine pottery gives way to simpler ware. Grand buildings are repaired with rougher stones. Coins once struck in abundance become scarce. Inscriptions celebrating victories or decrees become shorter, plainer, and eventually vanish. The silence of the empire grows layer by layer, not with fire but with stillness. In its provinces, the fading of central power gave rise to new forms of independence. Local leaders, once bound tightly to the empire, governed with greater autonomy. Villages became more self-reliant, less connected to distant cities. The empire's name was still spoken, but with less weight. Its banners still hung, but more as symbols of memory than of power. From afar, neighboring powers saw clearly what those within may not have noticed. They saw the borders weaken, the armies shrink, the wealth diminish. They saw an empire that once commanded respect reduced to a quieter presence, easier to ignore, easier to replace. Trade shifted elsewhere, alliances formed without it, and new centers of power rose. Yet within the empire itself, life continued in the same steady rhythm, proving that the collapse was not catastrophe but transformation. Even religion mirrored this soft decline. The temples stood, but their ceremonies grew humbler. Statues once gleaming with gold leaf stood unadorned. Priests carried on their rituals, but with smaller congregations. Belief did not vanish, but it retreated from imperial scale into household practice, into whispered prayers at night and private offerings in quiet corners. The gods seemed less distant, less grand, but more personal, woven into the everyday life of families, rather than proclaimed in great festivals. And so the empire faded, gently, almost invisibly, until one day it no longer existed as empire at all. What was left were communities, traditions, fragments of memory, and stones that still stood in silent testimony. The gentle collapse of this forgotten empire reminds us that endings are not always violent. Sometimes they are soft, gradual, and unnoticed until long after they have passed. It reminds us that greatness itself is fragile, and that time, steady and patient, outlasts even the most powerful creations of human hands. The final chapter of the Forgotten Empire's story is not one of flames or conquest, but of silence settling over what was once a mighty realm. Its collapse was gentle, and in that gentleness lies its uniqueness, for it shows us that the end of greatness does not always come with thunder, but often with a whisper. The empire that once commanded armies and controlled trade, that once filled its cities with noise and splendor, faded quietly into history until it became little more than memory. To understand this end, imagine walking through the ruins centuries later. The wide avenues remain, but grass grows between the stones. The walls of palaces still stand, but their roofs are gone, open to the sky. Temples still rise, but their statues are weathered and their altars cold. Silence hangs heavy, yet it is a silence filled with presence, with echoes of the lives once lived there. Every stone carries a memory, every worn step a trace of those who passed long ago. For the people who lived during the empire's last generations, the ending was not so obvious. Life continued. Families tended their fields, merchants traded what goods they could, priests still lit fires on altars, though smaller and humbler than before. Children grew, parents aged, and generations passed. To them, the empire still existed, though diminished, still present even as it weakened. Only in retrospect do we see that what they lived was the fading of empire into something smaller, quieter, and eventually forgotten. The empire's rulers held on as long as they could. They still wore crowns, still issued decrees, still sat in halls that echoed with the grandeur of the past. But their power no longer reached far. Their words no longer carried weight beyond their walls. Neighboring powers grew stronger, trade routes shifted, alliances bypassed them. The empire that had once been the center of the world was now a shadow at its edge. Its fall was not marked by one day or the one battle, but by the slow recognition that its strength was gone. Archaeologists and historians pieced together the fragments of its story: the coins that grew smaller, the pottery that grew simpler, the inscriptions that grew fewer. They see the signs of decline in the material culture, in the shift from abundance to modesty, from boldness to restraint. What they cannot fully capture, but what we can imagine, is the feeling of those who lived through it. The slow realization that the empire of their ancestors was no longer the empire of their present. The gentle collapse of this forgotten empire reminds us that history is not only made of victories and defeats, of dramatic turns and sudden endings. Much of history is made of gradual change, of lives lived quietly while great structures fade in the background. Empires may rise and fall, but people endure, adapting, surviving, carrying fragments of the past into the future. That endurance is perhaps the most powerful legacy of all. And so the empire slipped away, leaving behind ruins that still stand in silence, reminders of what once was. Its collapse was gentle, its fading slow, its story not of destruction, but of transformation. It did not vanish in an instant, but dissolved into time, becoming part of the earth, part of the memory of humanity. To walk among its remnants today is to feel both the presence of its greatness and the softness of its end. It whispers to us that all things pass, that even the mightiest fall, and that time, patient and steady, is stronger than stone. Yet in that whisper there is comfort, for the story does not end in tragedy, but in continuity, in the quiet persistence of life beyond empire. The gentle collapse of a forgotten empire is, in truth, a reminder that nothing lasts forever, and that is what makes every moment precious. And so our old story has come to an end. Before we move on, if you enjoyed this quiet journey, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps keep these calm stories alive. Now let us drift softly into the next tale in our Boring History for Sleep series. Tonight, we begin the sound of silence in ancient ruins. Across the world, scattered across deserts, mountains, and forests, there are ruins that once stood as living centers of human life. They were places where families gathered, where merchants exchanged goods, where priests performed rituals, and where rulers proclaimed their power. Today, however, these places stand in silence. Their walls may be broken, their roofs gone, their carvings faded, but they remain. And in their remaining, they speak not with words but with silence. A silence that is deeper than emptiness, a silence that carries the weight of centuries. To walk into such ruins is to step into a world where time seems suspended. The wind moves through open doorways, brushing against stones that have not felt human hands for generations. Birds nest in cracks of walls that once echoed with voices. Grass grows between the stones of streets that once carried the footsteps of thousands. The silence in these places is not void, but presence. It is as if the air itself remembers what was once here and now rests in stillness, carrying those memories quietly forward. Imagine entering a ruined city at dawn. The first light falls gently on crumbling walls, revealing outlines of houses, courtyards, and temples. The city is empty, yet it feels alive. Each stone seems to hold a whisper, each broken column a memory. Where once there were voices bargaining in the marketplace, there is now only the faint sound of the wind. Where once there was the sound of bells or drums in a temple, there is now only the cry of a bird overhead. The silence is not frightening. It is calming, like a deep breath held for centuries. The ruins do not demand attention, they invite reflection. They remind us that life once filled these places, that joy and sorrow, work and worship, laughter and grief all took place here, and that though those lives are gone, their traces remain. Archaeologists uncover fragments of pottery, tools, carvings, and inscriptions, each one a piece of the story. Yet even without these objects, the ruins themselves tell us much. The layout of streets shows us how people moved through the city. The size of houses tells us about families. the height of temples tells us what they valued. And above all, the silence tells us that all things pass. Empires rise, cities flourish, people live their lives, and then time carries it all away, leaving only stone and memory. The sound of silence in ancient ruins is powerful, because it allows us to hear what we cannot otherwise hear. It allows us to imagine the voices of the past, to sense the presence of those who are gone. When you stand in this middle of a ruined hall, open to the sky, the silence is filled with echoes, not literal echoes, but echoes of memory, of history, of humanity. It is a silence that asks us to listen, not with our ears, but with our imagination. For those who lived in these cities, the decline would have felt gradual. Walls fell slowly, roofs collapsed over time, streets grew overgrown inch by inch. People moved away, first a few, then many, until finally none remained. The silence we hear today was not sudden. It settled gently like dust, covering everything until the ruins became part of the landscape. And in that silence, the ruins became something new. They became not only remnants of the past, but teachers of the present, showing us the impermanence of human creation and the endurance of the natural world. To sit quietly among ancient ruins is to feel time differently. Minutes stretch, hours feel longer, the present blends with the past. The silence wraps around you, not empty but full of presence. It is a silence that comforts, reminding us that though everything changes, everything also continues. The stones remain, the earth endures, and the silence holds the memory of all that has passed. When one wanders through ancient ruins, what strikes first is not always the sight of broken stones, but the atmosphere that surrounds them. It is a stillness that feels unlike any other, a quiet that is both gentle and profound, as if the land itself has chosen to rest. This silence is not the silence of emptiness, for the ruins are not truly empty. They are filled with the invisible presence of centuries, of countless lives lived and gone, of stories once spoken aloud, now carried only by the air. Every wall that still stands, no matter how cracked or weathered, is a witness to this presence. In ancient times, these walls might have echoed with conversation, laughter, music, or ritual, but now they echo only with wind. And yet, if one listens carefully, it is as though those voices still linger, not as sound but as memory. The silence holds them, softens them, transforms them into something beyond words. Archaeologists who study such ruins often speak of the layers of history they uncover, each layer a trace of a life once lived. But the visitor who sits quietly among the stones uncovers something different, the feeling of continuity and impermanence bound together. The silence reminds us that what once seemed permanent was not, and yet what was thought lost is not entirely gone. It endures in fragments, in atmosphere, in the very silence that surrounds the ruins. Imagine walking along a street that has not felt the footsteps of citizens for 1,000 years. Grass grows between the stones, small flowers bloom in cracks, and the air is filled with the scent of earth rather than smoke or cooking fires. Once the street carried merchants, animals, carts, and the sound of daily life. Now it carries only the breeze. Yet as you walk, you sense that you are not alone. The stones themselves seem to remember. They are shaped by time, but also shaped by the countless feet that once passed over them. They hold those impressions still, even if no one can see them. The silence that surrounds them is not absence, but memory. Temples, too, carry this silence. Once filled with incense, chants, and offerings, they now stand open to the sky, their altars cold, their statues worn smooth. But the silence within them is deep, almost reverent. It feels as though the gods who were once worshipped there have not entirely left, but remain in the stillness, watching quietly as time continues without their ceremonies. Visitors who step into these spaces often lower their voices instinctively, as if they were still sacred, still demanding respect. Such is the power of silence. It makes us pause, reflect, and remember. The ruins are also shaped by nature, which fills the silence with its own rhythms. Birds nest in broken walls, insects hum in forgotten corners, roots wind their way through cracks, and rainwater pools in places once covered by roofs. The silence of human absence is softened by the presence of the natural world. It is not a void, but a transformation, as if the earth has claimed the ruins as its own. In this way, the silence is not death, but life in another form. To sit among these ruins at dusk is to feel this most clearly. As the sun lowers, shadows lengthen, and the silence deepens, wrapping itself around you like a cloak. The air cools, the colors fade, and the stones seem to settle into their rest. It is a silence that invites you to breathe more slowly, to let go of urgency, to feel connected to something larger than yourself. The ruins whisper not of endings, but of continuity, reminding us that though civilizations rise and fall, the earth remains, the silence endures, and memory persists. To wander through the remnants of an ancient city is to step into a dialogue between time and silence. The ruins speak, not with voices but with presence, and the silence that fills them is heavy with meaning. It is a silence that carries memory, a silence that feels almost alive. Once, these spaces rang with sound, merchants bargaining loudly in busy markets, children running through courtyards, priests chanting within echoing temples, rulers addressing gathered crowds. Now those sounds are gone, replaced by the whisper of the wind, the cry of a bird, the rustle of leaves that have grown through cracks in the stone. Yet somehow, the silence does not feel like emptiness. It feels like a layer of history, covering what has passed but preserving it in a way words never could. Imagine entering what was once a grand marketplace. The space is wide, the stones uneven but still in place, and the faint outlines of stalls can be traced if one looks carefully. Centuries ago, this would have been the busiest part of the city, alive with voices calling out prices, with the sound of animals, with the clatter of goods being exchanged. Now it is quiet, the stalls long gone, the walls broken, the air still, but the silence is not barren. It invites the imagination to fill the space, to sense the energy that once pulsed there. You hear nothing, yet you feel everything. This is the sound of silence in ancient ruins. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of memory. Temples often hold the deepest silence. Their altars, once glowing with fire and offerings, are cold, their statues worn by weather, their roofs open to the sky. Yet when you step inside, the silence feels sacred, as though it holds within it the echoes of countless prayers. Visitors instinctively whisper or fall silent themselves, as if respecting a space still holy, even though its rituals have long ceased. The gods may no longer be worshipped here, but the silence seems to guard their memory, carrying a reverence that has not faded. In residential ruins, where families once lived, the silence takes another form. Houses stand in partial walls, their rooms open to the sky. You can walk through what was once a kitchen, a courtyard, a place where children played. The silence here feels intimate, tender, filled with the lives of ordinary people. You imagine laughter, conversations, daily routines, all gone yet somehow lingering in the stones. The ruins do not speak these memories aloud, but they let you feel them in the stillness. Archaeologists uncover the fragments of these lives, pottery, tools, inscriptions, but the silence of the ruins gives them context. It reminds us that these objects were once part of lives lived fully, not just relics in glass cases. Nature joins this silence, adding its own gentle sound. Birds nest in arches, their calls echoing softly. Trees grow where courtyards once stood, their branches swaying in the wind. Rain drips from broken roofs, its rhythm steady and calm. The ruins are no longer filled with human voices, but they are not mute. They are filled with the quiet music of the natural world. This blending of silence and sound creates an atmosphere of calm that can feel timeless. To sit among the ruins at midday, when the sun is high and the air still, is to feel wrapped in a silence so complete that even your own breath seems louder than it should. To remain there until dusk, when shadows stretch and colors fade, is to feel part of something enduring, something that transcends the rise and fall of civilizations. The silence of the ruins is not just the absence of people, it is the presence of time itself, unfolding slowly, reminding us that all things pass, but in passing, they leave traces. And those traces speak most clearly not in words, but in silence. The silence of ancient ruins is unlike any other silence, for it is filled with the weight of centuries. When you stand among broken columns and fallen walls, you are surrounded by more than stone. You are surrounded by memory, by echoes of lives that once filled these spaces. The silence here is not empty. It is dense, layered, carrying with it all that has passed. Every ruin, no matter how small, once held human presence, and that presence lingers in ways we cannot hear with our ears but can feel with our hearts. Imagine walking into what was once a grand hall, its roof long collapsed, its walls cracked but still upright. The air is still, heavy with warmth in the day or cool in the evening. Long ago, this hall may have been filled with voices, with ceremonies, with the sound of drums or chants rising into the air. Now those sounds are gone, but the silence does not erase them. It holds them gently, like an echo that has stretched across time. To listen to the silence here is to listen to history itself, speaking softly, reminding us of the impermanence of all things. Streets that were once busy with life are now overgrown with grass, their stones uneven and worn. The sound of carts, animals, and footsteps has been replaced by the whisper of the wind. Yet the silence does not feel barren. It feels alive with what once was. As you walk, you imagine the conversations that once filled the air, the laughter of children, the calls of merchants. None of these sounds remain, but the silence seems to carry their memory, inviting you to fill it with imagination. Temples stand as some of the most powerful keepers of silence. Their sacred spaces, once alive with prayer and incense, are now quiet under the open sky. Statues of gods are worn smooth, their faces softened by rain and time, yet the silence around them feels reverent, as though belief itself has not entirely vanished. Visitors often lower their voices here, even without being told, because the silence demands respect. It is not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, a reminder that something greater once filled these walls. In the remains of homes, the silence takes on another character. You might step into what was once a courtyard, surrounded by low walls open to the sky. Families lived here, cooked meals here, told stories here. Now the silence lies over it all, but if you listen closely, you can almost hear the faint echoes of daily life. It is a gentle silence, intimate, filled with memory of ordinary people. It speaks not of kings or priests, but of families, of children, of the rhythm of living. Archaeologists uncover evidence of these lives, fragments of pottery, tools, pieces of jewelry, but it is the silence of the ruins that gives those fragments their meaning. Without the silence, they would be only objects. With it, they become part of a story, reminders of lives once lived fully. Nature, too, fills these ruins with its own quiet music. Birds call from high perches, insects hum in the air, roots twist through broken stones, and rain falls softly into empty courtyards. This sound is not noise. It blends with the silence, enriching it, giving it depth. The ruins are no longer held by human voices, but they are not mute. They have become part of the earth again, and the silence is their new voice. To sit among these ruins at twilight is to feel this truth most deeply. The shadows grow long, the light fades, and the silence grows stronger. It wraps around you, soft and heavy, reminding you that you are small within the flow of time, but also connected to it. The ruins are silent, but they are not gone. They stand as witnesses, as reminders, as teachers. The sound of silence in ancient ruins is not emptiness. It is history, memory, and continuity, all carried in the stillness of the present. The silence that lingers in ancient ruins has a way of drawing us into reflection, for it is a silence that belongs not only to the stones, but also to time itself. When you walk through these places, you are not merely seeing remnants of walls or columns. You are encountering the weight of centuries, held in stillness. Every crack in the stone, every faded carving, every broken arch holds within it the story of countless lives. Though no voices rise here now, the silence is thick with memory, and it is this quality that makes the ruins feel alive, even in their abandonment. Consider the remains of a great amphitheater, once filled with thousands of people, their voices rising in cheers, their footsteps echoing against stone seats. Today, the seats are worn, the stage is broken, and the wind sweeps gently across the space. No one performs, no one shouts, yet the silence carries the echo of all that energy. It is as though the ruins themselves remember and hold the memory within their quiet. The silence is not emptiness, but presence, a reminder of how life once filled this place. In marketplaces that once bustled with merchants and traders, silence takes another form. The outlines of stalls remain, the stones of the road are still there, but where once voices bargained and animals brayed, there is only the rustle of grass and the sound of wind. Standing there, one can almost imagine the energy that once filled the air, the exchange of goods and stories, the mingling of cultures. Now all of that is gone, and in its place is silence, but it is a silence that still speaks, reminding us that human connection once thrived here. Temples, too, embody this transformation. Once the center of sacred ceremonies, filled with incense smoke and the sound of chanting, they now stand open to the sky, their altars bare. Yet when you enter, the silence feels sacred rather than empty. It is as though the prayers once spoken here still linger, not as sound but as atmosphere. Visitors instinctively lower their voices, sensing the reverence that remains even without ritual. The silence here is not absence but reverence, a reminder that belief itself leaves an imprint even after centuries have passed. The ruins of homes tell another layer of the story. In the small courtyards and narrow rooms, silence is more intimate. Families once cooked, laughed, argued, and told stories in these spaces. Now they are open to the elements, filled with weeds and light, but the silence they hold is gentle, like the fading memory of everyday life. It is not the grandeur of temples or palaces, but the quiet of ordinary existence. The silence in these ruins is tender, carrying the memory of daily lives long forgotten by history, but still present in the stones. Archaeologists uncover objects that give us glimpses of these lives. Broken pots, worn tools, small ornaments. Yet it is the silence of the ruins themselves that ties these objects into a story. Without the ruins, the objects would be disconnected. With the ruins and with the silence that fills them, they become part of a whole, fragments of human existence preserved in stillness. Nature adds its own voice to the silence. Birds nest in high walls, their calls echoing softly. Trees grow where courtyards once stood, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Rain falls on stones, its rhythm blending into the quiet. The ruins are no longer alive with human presence, but they are alive with the quiet rhythms of the earth. The silence is not lifeless, it is simply filled with different life, with a slower and steadier pulse. To sit among these ruins is to feel this pulse, to hear the silence as if it were a language of its own. It tells us that all things pass, but nothing is entirely lost. Civilizations may fade, voices may vanish, but the stones remain, and in their silence they preserve memory. The sound of silence in ancient ruins is, in truth, the sound of time itself, enduring, patient, and eternal. The silence that rests in ancient ruins is not merely the absence of human voices, but the presence of time itself, pressing softly upon every stone and fragment. When you walk among the broken walls, you feel it wrapping around you, a calm weight that settles over the senses. The ruins do not shout their story, they whisper it, and their whispers are carried not in sound but in stillness. The silence is thick, yet it is gentle, offering you a chance to listen more deeply than you ever do in the noisy world beyond. Imagine approaching the remains of a grand gate, its towers now crumbling, its carvings faded, its doors long vanished. Once this gateway welcomed travelers, merchants, and dignitaries, the air filled with the sound of voices and footsteps, with the creak of carts and the calls of guards. Today, it stands in quiet dignity. The silence here is different. It is a silence of passage, reminding you of all those who once entered and left through this gate, of the countless stories that began and ended in its shadow. Step beyond the gate and into what was once the heart of the city, and the silence changes again. Here, wide streets stretch ahead, lined with broken stones. Grass pushes up between them, flowers bloom in cracks, and the air hums softly with insects. Centuries ago, this street was alive with the energy of thousands, the marketplace bustling, the sound of music and conversation filling the air. Now, the only sound is the faint movement of the wind. And yet, the silence does not erase what once was. It holds it, like a canvas holds a faded painting. If you stand still long enough, you can almost sense the movement, almost hear the laughter, almost feel the life that once filled the space. In the ruins of temples, the silence grows deeper. These were places where prayers rose, where chants echoed, where incense drifted upward into rafters now long gone. Today, the roof is open to the sky. The altar is empty, the statues worn smooth, but the silence feels sacred. It is the silence of reverence, of memory held in stone. Visitors instinctively lower their voices here, not because anyone commands them, but because the silence itself commands respect. It is as though the prayers once spoken here still linger, not as sound but as presence. Even in the ruins of ordinary houses, the silence has its own character. Small courtyards lie open. Rooms stand in partial walls, and weeds grow where families once lived. The silence here is gentle, domestic, filled with traces of ordinary life. You can imagine parents calling their children, meals being prepared, stories being told by firelight. All of it is gone, and yet all of it remains, wrapped into the silence of these spaces. The ruins tell us that history is not only about rulers and temples, but also about families, about the everyday rhythm of life, about the quiet endurance of humanity. Archaeologists uncover objects that confirm this: tools, pottery, jewelry, but it is the silence of the ruins that breathes life into these objects. Without the ruins, they are just fragments. Within the ruins, and within the silence, they become part of a greater story, tied together by memory and time. Nature adds its own notes to the silence, making it richer rather than breaking it. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the cry of a bird perched high in a broken arch, the drip of water after rain, all of these blend with the silence, giving it texture and rhythm. The ruins are not mute. They speak with the language of the earth. Their silence is not lifeless but alive, filled with the steady pulse of nature, reclaiming what was once human space. To sit in these ruins at night is to feel the silence in its most profound form. The stars above shine where once there were roofs, and the moonlight casts shadows where once there were torches. The silence deepens, becoming almost tangible, as though the ruins themselves breathe slowly with the night. In that silence, you feel the presence of all that has passed, and you sense that nothing is truly lost. The sound of silence in ancient ruins is not emptiness. It is continuity, the echo of time, the voice of history spoken without words. The sound of silence in ancient ruins carries with it a sense of dignity that even centuries of abandonment cannot erase. When you stand among broken columns, worn thresholds, and walls open to the sky, you feel that you are in the presence of something enduring. The silence is not empty. It is filled with echoes of lives long gone, with the weight of history resting gently in the air. Each ruin, no matter how small, still holds within it the essence of the people who built it, lived in it, and left it behind. The silence is their voice, softer now, but no less powerful. Picture a grand forum or public square, once filled with the bustle of citizens debating, trading, and celebrating. The sound of countless footsteps would have echoed on the stone, voices rising together in a chorus of life. Today, the space is wide and open, the outlines of buildings still visible, but the square is quiet. The silence here feels expansive, as though the absence of noise makes the space even larger. You walk across it, hearing only the sound of your own steps, and the silence seems to invite you to imagine what once filled this place. It is not a silence of absence, but a silence of memory, one that holds the energy of all that came before. Move into the remains of a palace, and the silence changes. These halls once held rulers, courtiers, and guards, their conversations echoing off painted walls, their presence filling the air with authority. Now the walls are cracked, the floors uneven, the roofs gone. Yet the silence that rests here is not ordinary. It is the silence of power faded, the silence of grandeur remembered but no longer present. It feels almost heavy, as though the stones themselves remember the weight of crowns and the echo of commands. Even in silence, the palace speaks of what once was. In temples, the silence takes on a sacred tone. Where once priests chanted, incense filled the air, and worshippers gathered in reverence. There is now only the soft hush of wind and the faint calls of birds. Yet stepping into such a space, you instinctively lower your voice, as though the silence itself demands respect. The gods may no longer be worshipped here, but their memory lingers, carried in the stillness. The silence is not absence. It is reverence, the echo of belief held for centuries in stone. In the ruins of homes, the silence feels gentler, more intimate. These were not spaces of power or ceremony, but of family life. Small courtyards, narrow rooms, kitchens, and gardens now lie in fragments, open to the sky. The silence here feels personal, as though it remembers not rulers and gods, but but parents, children, meals shared, and stories told by firelight. It is a silence that invites you to imagine the laughter, the conversations, the rhythm of ordinary living. In its gentleness, it is perhaps the most human silence of all. Archaeologists find in these ruins fragments of pottery, tools, ornaments, and writings. But the silence itself is the greatest artifact. It provides context to the objects, tying them into a living story of a place that was once alive with sound. Without the silence, these would be scattered fragments. With it, they become part of a whole, part of the enduring memory of a civilization. Nature plays its role as well, blending with the silence to create an atmosphere both calm and eternal. Trees rise through broken walls, their roots gripping stones. Birds fill the air with soft calls that echo gently across open courtyards. Rain falls, its rhythm slow and steady, absorbed into the silence rather than breaking it. The ruins are not lifeless. They have been reclaimed by the earth, and in that reclamation, they continue to live. To remain among them at dusk, as shadows lengthen and the air cools, is to feel the silence deepen, wrapping itself around everything. The ruins seem to breathe with the night, their silence stretching into the stars. And in that silence, you realize that nothing is ever truly lost, that the voices of the past endure in the stillness, that time itself speaks most clearly when it speaks through silence. The silence that lingers in ancient ruins is not the silence of nothingness, but the silence of continuity. A silence that has lasted longer than empires, longer than memory, and longer than the voices that once filled these spaces. When you stand among the broken remains of cities, palaces, and temples, you are standing in a silence that has been shaped by centuries of presence and absence, of human creation and natural reclamation. This silence is layered, textured, and alive with meaning. Imagine walking into the remains of a theater carved into stone. Once it was alive with music, speeches, and performances. Crowds filled the seats, their voices rising together, their applause echoing across the stage. Today, the seats are worn and cracked. Plants grow in the corners, and the air is still. The silence here feels almost theatrical, as though the stage is waiting for actors who will never return. Yet in that silence, you can sense the energy of the performances that once took place, the stories once told, the emotions once shared. The silence has become the final performance, a play written by time itself. In the ruins of markets, the silence feels different. These spaces once overflowed with energy, merchants calling out prices, animals bleating, coins clattering, voices mingling in countless languages. Now the stalls are gone, the roads uneven, the air filled only with the whisper of wind. The silence here is not barren but full of echoes. It reminds us that human connection once thrived here, that countless hands exchanged goods and countless lives crossed paths. It is a silence that speaks of commerce, of culture, of community, all carried quietly into the present. Temples hold the deepest silences of all. Their walls may be broken, their statues weathered, their altars bare, but when you step inside, the silence feels sacred. It is as though the prayers spoken here long ago never fully left. They linger in the air, not as sound but as presence, shaping the atmosphere with reverence. Visitors often lower their voices instinctively, sensing that they are in a place where belief once thrived. The silence of a temple is not absence, it is reverence, the echo of faith that time itself has preserved. Even in the smallest of ruins, where only fragments remain, the silence has its own voice. A single standing wall, a broken arch, a scattered foundation, all hold within them the memory of what once was. You may hear nothing, but the silence itself invites you to imagine, to reconstruct in your mind, the lives that unfolded here. It is a silence that engages the imagination, turning absence into presence, turning ruins into living memory. Nature enriches this silence, blending with it to create something timeless. Birds call from high perches, their sounds carried softly across empty courtyards. The rustle of leaves in the wind adds movement to still air. Rain falls, dripping steadily onto stones that once supported roofs. These sounds do not break the silence, they complete it. The ruins are not mute, they speak in the language of nature, a language that reminds us that life continues even as civilizations fade. Archaeologists find traces of these lives in objects, pottery, tools, inscriptions, but the silence of the ruins provides the deeper context. It ties together the fragments, gives them meaning, and connects them to the atmosphere of memory. Without the silence, these would be objects of study. With the silence, they become pieces of a story, part of the greater whole that the ruins continue to tell. To sit among ancient ruins at night is to feel the silence most profoundly. The stars shine where once there were roofs, and the moonlight paints broken walls in silver. The silence deepens, becoming almost tangible, a presence that wraps around you. In that silence, you feel the endurance of time, the persistence of memory, and the truth that nothing is ever fully lost. The sound of silence in ancient ruins is not emptiness. It is the voice of history, spoken softly but eternally, inviting us to listen. The silence that rests in ancient ruins carries with it an almost timeless quality, as though the stones themselves have absorbed the rhythm of centuries and now release it in stillness. When you step into these places, you are stepping into a dialogue between the present and the past, a dialogue spoken without words, carried only by the hush that surrounds you. It is a silence that seems to pause the world, slowing your breath, softening your thoughts, reminding you that life once flourished here and has now moved on, leaving behind traces held gently in stone. Imagine walking through the remnants of a grand avenue once used for processions and ceremonies. Centuries ago, this space would have been alive with music, banners, and voices rising together in celebration. Today, the stones of the road are uneven, weeds push through the cracks, and the air is still. Yet in the silence, you can almost feel the weight of those processions, almost see the outlines of figures passing by. The silence is not emptiness, it is memory carried in stillness, a reminder that history lingers, even when sound has faded. Move into the ruins of an old bathhouse or gathering hall, where water once flowed and voices echoed against stone walls. Now the pools are dry, the walls broken, the echoes gone, but the silence has its own depth here, a kind of resonance that makes you feel the space is not truly empty. It is filled with the memory of countless conversations, of laughter, of human presence. The silence is thicker than air, and as you stand within it, you sense that time itself is speaking. Temples offer another kind of silence. Once the heart of devotion, they were filled with incense, chants, and offerings. Now they are open to the sky, their altars bare, their statues softened by weather. Yet when you enter, the silence feels holy. Visitors instinctively lower their voices, as though respecting a sacredness that remains. The prayers of centuries past have dissolved into the air, but their essence lingers in the quiet. This silence is not absence, but reverence, a reminder that belief leaves an imprint even after its ceremonies have ceased. In homes, the silence feels more personal. These were the spaces of ordinary lives, of meals, of laughter, of stories told around firelight. Now they are fragments of walls, open to sun and rain. Yet the silence here feels tender, as though it remembers the small joys and struggles of the people who once lived here. It is not the silence of grandeur, but the silence of intimacy. Carrying the faint traces of family life long gone, nature enriches all of these silences. Birds nest in high arches, their calls echoing softly. Trees rise through broken walls, their roots gripping stone. Rain falls gently, pooling in courtyards where once there were gatherings. The silence of human absence is blended with the sounds of the earth, creating a harmony that feels eternal. The ruins are no longer shaped by human voices, but they are not mute. They are filled with the quiet pulse of nature reclaiming space. Archaeologists uncover artifacts, tools, coins, fragments of art. But the silence of the ruins is the greatest artifact of all. It binds together the fragments, giving them context and atmosphere. Without the silence, these would be isolated objects. Within the silence, they become part of a story, part of the greater memory of a civilization. To remain among ruins as night falls is to feel this silence most intensely. The sky darkens, stars appear, and the stones glow faintly under the moon. The silence deepens, becoming almost tangible, wrapping you in its weight. In that moment, you feel connected not only to the ruins, but to all of history, as though the silence itself is a thread linking past and present. The sound of silence in ancient ruins is not the sound of emptiness. It is the sound of time, patient and enduring, reminding us that though voices vanish, their memory lingers in stillness. The sound of silence in ancient ruins is not the end of a story, but its continuation in another form. For even in their abandonment, these places are never truly gone. They endure as guardians of memory, carrying within their stillness the weight of centuries. When you walk among the ruins, you feel that you are part of something greater than yourself, a rhythm of time that stretches far beyond human life. The silence here does not speak in words, yet it tells you everything. That greatness fades, that voices vanish, but that presence lingers. It is the sound of time itself, holding history gently in its arms. Imagine standing in the remains of a city at dawn. The first light of the sun touches broken walls, casting long shadows across the stones. Once, the same light would have revealed busy streets filled with people, carts, and animals, all moving with purpose. Now it reveals stillness, yet the silence is not barren. It feels as though the lives that once filled the city are still here, woven into the stones, carried by the air. Each step you take feels heavier, as though you are walking not just through space, but through memory. In palaces, the silence speaks of power lost to time. These halls once rang with commands, with music, with the steps of rulers and guards. Today, they echo only with the wind. Yet in that wind is a reminder that authority is fleeting, that crowns and thrones cannot resist the patient hand of time. The silence here is not emptiness, but humility, reminding us that even the grandest powers yield to the earth. In temples, the silence is sacred. The gods once honored with offerings and chants are no longer worshipped, yet their presence lingers in the stillness. The altars are bare, the statues worn smooth, the roofs open to the sky, but the silence itself feels like prayer. It is reverence distilled into its purest form, a reminder that belief leaves traces long after rituals have ceased. Visitors instinctively sense this, lowering their voices, moving softly, respecting a holiness that survives in silence. In the remains of homes, the silence is intimate, tender. Families once filled these rooms with laughter, with meals, with everyday struggles and joys. Now they are fragments open to sun and rain, but the silence they hold is gentle, carrying the faint presence of ordinary lives. It is here that the ruins feel most human, reminding us that history is not only about rulers and battles, but also about families who lived, loved, and endured. Archaeologists uncover artifacts, pots, tools, ornaments, that help us piece together the story. But it is the silence that ties them together. Without the silence of the ruins, they are simply objects. With it, they become voices, part of a larger narrative of civilization. Nature joins in, softening the silence with its own rhythm. Birds call from perches on broken walls, rain falls gently into empty courtyards, roots push through stone, and trees rise where roofs once stood. These sounds do not break the silence. They complete it, blending with it to create an atmosphere both calm and eternal. The ruins are no longer held by human voices, but they are not lifeless. They are alive with the quiet pulse of the earth. To sit among the ruins at night is to feel the silence in its deepest form. The stars stretch above, the moon paints the stones in silver, and the air is still. In that silence, you feel connected not only to the past, but to all of time itself. It is a silence that humbles and comforts, reminding you that all things pass, yet nothing is entirely lost. The voices fade, but the stones remember. The civilizations crumble, but the earth endures. And in the silence, the memory of humanity continues. The sound of silence in ancient ruins is, in truth, the voice of history spoken softly, a reminder that even when words vanish, presence remains, eternal and unbroken. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with Sleep Whisper. May your new day, when you awaken, be filled with luck, calm, and success in all that you do. Sweet dreams tonight, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow evening here at Sleep Whisper.